The year is 2012. Super Monkey Ball has gone from one of the most well-regarded game series of the 6th generation of video game consoles, especially the Nintendo GameCube, to just another largely forgotten Sega IP. After a rocky attempt to maintain the series after its original development team moved on to the Yakuza series, Super Monkey Ball was largely reduced to a shell of its former self. While intermittent releases would make their way to systems over the years, an ill-fated PS Vita game, Super Monkey Ball Banana Splits, would become the series' last new release of both the decade and the foreseeable future. 2 years after this, in 2014, something happened that would change Super Monkey Ball forever. It wouldn't come from Amusement Vision, nor Sega in any capacity, but rather dedicated fans, ready to make the Monkey Ball games they always wanted to see. Welcome to the world of Super Monkey Ball Romhacking.
I'm Unofficial.
My name is Interval.
Hello everyone, my name is Sega the Saga.
My name is Aaron. I go by Charum, the official Charum, or honestly even just Aaron.
My name is Brandon. My gamer tag is Brandon SMB.
I'm Bomb Squad. I also go by the Bomb Squad.
My real name is Andrew. My IGN is Dairude.
My name is Walker. My gamer tag is also Walker, but without the E.
Hello, I am Nambo.
So I am Ike SMB.
Hi, I'm Kutzman, which, it's my gamer tag. It's not my real name, obviously.
The timeline for Monkey Ball Romhacking begins in June of 2014, when user YoshiMaster96 first showcases his work to the romhacking.net forum. Custom level modifications in both Super Monkey Ball 1 and 2. As with any early alteration to a game ROM, especially with games never released for PC, the early level alteration was crude and barely functional. There was even a point in time where textures and level collision were not connected, as the game stores that information in two separate files. Eventually though, basic tools for level creation were produced.
Basically, you just create a regular mall, like an OBJ, it's pretty standard. That part's the easy part. The other part was you have to place objects in the scene. Before I had a text file that you'd put into a command line program to do that, but as things progressed, now we have GUI stuff for that, so.
Kit, one of the most influential Monkey Ball speedrunners to ever exist, created this series called Super Monkey Ball Maker, and it was just a little series showing off levels that Kit had created and wanted to show off to the world. And a lot of people were really interested, hey, I want to make these levels too.
And it was then that Monkey Ball Romhacking enters its first generation. This was the time frame spanning from YoshiMaster's original work all the way to October 12th of 2016, wherein Krabs released his work. It's at this time that we begin to see level modders attempt to take the game's usable mechanics to their limit, as well as attempts to push the limits of level geometry. While the number of tries that level modders could use to build a level was paltry by modern standards, the employment of complex and awkward structures was still fairly widespread, often being used to illustrate the way it affected movement. There were also other ideas that were used at this time that are largely antiquated by today's standards, notably bumper jumps. These particular hellspawn took advantage of the never officially utilized top collision of the bumper obstacle, wherein if fallen onto in a near-perfect way, the bumper will propel you upward. This trick, while admittedly intriguing, is a nightmare to experience and play without highly specialized placement and purpose. These days, a system for placing dedicated jump platforms has been introduced, offering creators an option to tweak their jump altitude to what best suits the level design, and offer players a way to jump in levels that's nowhere near as frustrating. And that's just one example. Tons of early, more antiquated level ideas have been modernized into newer, more professional-looking form. Almost all of the level modding from this time was done to the first Monkey Ball game, as opposed to its sequel. Before Workshop 1 became standard, essentially all tools were made with SMB 1 in mind, leaving SMB 2 behind until then. This had the unfortunate side effect of leaving Monkey Ball 2's portals and switches dormant, only being introduced around 2018. Nonetheless, there are some surprisingly well-crafted levels from this time period, in spite of the massive limitations and barriers to entry there were at the time. Notably, the levels here that use the starting gates all hold up rather well. There's also some charming, if crude, attempts at shading and custom textures long before the game's lighting could be edited, and therefore properly utilized. If you have any interest in these, in the words of Yokai Jesus, crusty early levels, I recommend checking out Super Monkey Ball Gold and Platinum. They're compilation packs of everything that came from this era, making the process of playing them tremendously easier. Regardless, we've now reached October 12th of 2016, where the era of crabs begins. It might seem odd to call this the era of crabs when you look at what actually came out during this time. A whopping 1 of these was made by crabs, and it's only 20 levels. Well, and bear in mind that before this, these were the best looking levels. Take a look at these. Yeah, pretty crazy, right? Crabs made levels with such a high degree of polish both in their level design and their aesthetics that neither would be topped for 2 whole years. Sadly, Crabs drifted away from the ROM hacking scene after an incredible set of 20 levels, but his work had an undeniable impact. Only a few months later, Community Pack 1.0 would be released. This was the first ever attempt from the Monkey Ball community to develop a version of Monkey Ball 2 that contained entirely fan-created levels. It's honestly pretty remarkable that even this early on, there were level packs of this scale. But then again, a solid chunk of these are just far earlier levels from the pre-Crabs days, compiled into one massive release. Still, creators Pseudonymous BN first made their mark here, so that's neat. This was also the time frame wherein Cherem first began development of Banana Bash, and wherein Sega the Saga began development of Super Monkey Ball Dimensions. The first community pack was an undeniable landmark, but it took a team of 26 creators to get us here this early. As you can imagine, a single person developing a pack of this scale, all on their own, was probably a few years off, right? Logic would dictate yes, but as we're about to see, this particular individual has no problem defying logic and expectations. For better or for worse. Just a mere 2 months after a massive team of 26 developers managed to pull off a full game alteration, one of those 26 would do it all on his own. NGUU 2055. Okay, that's not entirely fair. While by this point in time every level in the game could be replaced, NGUU 1 wasn't 100% original. Even the most generous interpretation puts the stage count at 58 original levels, with the least generous count coming to only 30. Still, I don't want to rag on NGUU too much. What he has here is still, in my eyes, somewhat impressive for the time, and should be respected as such. Near the end of the year, and the first few days of 2018, Community Pack 1.5, 3 additional NGUU packs, and a few creator debut packs would be released. The former was a complete overhaul of the previous entry with new creators and new levels, while the NGUU packs, well, NGUU Story and Arcade are alright enough in respect to their release time, with one getting a pretty solid update not long after it was released. NGUU 2, however, was largely considered contentious even at the time of its release. As for those creator debuts, only 4 would continue to evolve into later generations. Those were Monkey Ball Ultra, Banana Bash, Dimensions, and Super Alex Ball. Ultra would go dormant after its March 2018 update, while Banana Bash and Dimensions would undergo extensive and multifaceted development cycles for many years. Super Alex Ball, though? That became the next era-defining ROM hack, Monkey Ball. We'll get to that later, though. All you need to know for now is that tools continue to improve, notably when members like the Bomb Squad began developing quality of life improvements. The use of switches and portals also became standard around this time, becoming almost as trivial as placing bananas with modern tools.
I ported and rewrote a tool that is a level editor plugin for Blender, originally developed by Crafted Car, who's another wonderful member of the hacking community. Tool's known as Blend to SMB stage. I also updated the back end of this tool, which is the SMB Workshop 2 tool, which is quite commonly used, and in fact it's pretty much essential for level creation. Some of the things I've done, I've added support for new features such as animated backgrounds, JAMA bars, which are the punchy things in SMB1 that everyone seems to hate, texture scroll, dynamic shadows, transparency, custom fog. I've also done some work that has allowed for more complex level animation to be possible. Most recently, I've been doing work on custom monkey race and monkey golf levels, some of which have been showing up in some of the newer packs. I think Cherum's latest pack has it, NGUU's latest pack has it, stuff like that.
Regardless, we're going to pause the history lesson for now and shift gears into a more in-depth analysis. As from the Monkey Ball era onward, the standard for level design and aesthetics has become high enough to be worth consistently delving into. Before we can do that though, we have to categorize the over 50 ROM hacks we'll be going over. Let's get into it. Over the past 6 months or so, I've been in the process of developing a spreadsheet that has every Monkey Ball ROM hack. This goal, while perhaps a little misguided at first, eventually culminated into what you're seeing on screen now. A quick thanks to everyone who helped me confirm or deny their info on this sheet, and a thanks as well to those working on the Wiki, my primary tool for compiling all this information, outside of my own testing. After significant deliberation, I have decided that the ideal starting and ending points for this retrospective will be January 5th of 2018 and December 31st of 2020, respectively. These times were chosen to coincide with what could be considered generations 3 and 4. Ending at the year mark will also make future videos much easier, and to the endpoint being what it is. Still, if a ROM hack was released from within this time frame and receives an update after it, I'll look at the latest version of said ROM hack. However, if a ROM hack was in development during this time frame, but didn't see an official release until 2021, I'm afraid it'll have to wait. Sorry, Gemmod. Nonetheless, later projects will also get their due. Trust me. But for now, let's focus on what's been released in SMB ROM hacking over the last 3 years. Most of these Monkey Ball ROM hacks are custom level packs, featuring anywhere from 1 level replacement to more stages than Super Monkey Ball Deluxe. Overall though, most ROM hacks are 30 stages or less, although many of them are still in development. Also, any demos that contain more than 10 stages was included, but demos containing less than that were not looked at for this video. They're in the spreadsheet though. Unfortunately, there was also a small handful of build files that either didn't work or weren't configured very user-friendly to begin with. There was also a few ROM hacks that just had broken links, so I won't be showcasing either of those here. If anyone has a complete and working ISO for the ROM hacks on your screen, let me know in the comments or email me a link to either a Google Drive or Mega Download for them. Even with those unavailable, we still have over 50 ROM hacks to cover. So let's go over the categories we'll be discussing today, starting with the non-level mod ROM hacks. First, we have unofficial ports with 2 entries. Second, we have control modifications with 3 entries. And third, we have miscellaneous alterations with 3 entries. From there, we have the level pack categories. Fourth, we have small packs with 19 entries. Fifth, we have larger scale packs with 4 entries. And sixth, we have complete packs. Complete packs have to either A, have a complete story mode, or B, have a complete set of challenge modes. Or both. There are also the aforementioned small demos, not working packs, and post-Community Pack 2020 releases, aside from updates. Lastly, there's the special case of Banana Bash, which I'll save for the complete packs discussion. Nonetheless, these remaining criteria account for the remaining ROM hacks, of which we'll only be looking at the 5 related to Banana Bash. So without further ado, let's get into our first category. So this one only has 2 entries, but both of them are pretty much complete game overhauls in their own right. The first is Sonic and 15 Super Monkey Ball Arcade, a complete reskin of Super Monkey Ball 1, while the second is Super Monkey Ball Deluxe in SMB 2, which imports every single level from Super Monkey Ball Deluxe and puts it back into the GameCube version of Super Monkey Ball 2. Starting off with the arcade mod, I have to admit I'm confused by a lot of the design choices made here. I was originally expecting this one to be a highly accurate version of the arcade game graphically, but in actuality, it takes a lot more liberties than it initially lets on. The Skyworld theme looks fine, but bonus stages aren't the tan color they are in the actual release. I like the dark blue they chose here, but it just isn't accurate. This is even weirder when you look at the SMB credits minigame, where I'm pretty sure they used the original floor from Arcade. From there you get a decent looking recreation of the water level theme, but then you reach the desert, which just looks gross. The brassy tones of the original made it the only stage that looked arguably better than its super counterpart, making this even more disappointing. Arctic and Storm look fine, but Interstellar had some weird graphical problems / choices. Truth be told, I'm not sure which. Master looks good though, even better than Super in my opinion. Easily the worst loss though isn't actually the graphics, it's the music. Arcade has, in my opinion anyway, the best score in the entire series, so it's a real shame to not have that here when the other hacks actually included it, proving that it can totally be done. Overall, I can only recommend this one for the Master Stage's new aesthetic. Beyond that, just use Demule if you want to try Monkey Ball Arcade. Fortunately, the second hack fares a lot better, but admittedly had a lot more people backing it. Besides cases like the Community Pack, this ROM hack had the biggest development crew out of any in this retrospective. Nonetheless, this hack is rather simple in concept and executed rather well. As stated in my first Monkey Ball video, this hack includes every single level that was present in Super Monkey Ball Deluxe, and via the SMB2 game engine, does so with performance identical to the Xbox release, although with some tweaks to overall improve the aesthetic, and even performance in some cases.
At first, the whole thing started as, a pack just including the deluxe exclusives. Then it kind of expanded a little bit, but since we figured out how to extend difficulties. We struggled at first to port a few levels because of how the animations are. We had to end up making more tools for stuff like that, converters. Converting Monkey Ball 1 or Deluxe stages directly into Monkey Ball 2 file format.
Unfortunately, other features like competition mode have not been reincorporated yet, so this purely exists as a port of levels into SMB2. In regards to that goal though, it does an exceptional job, so it maintains my seal of approval. Alright, porting content from other games is one thing, but from here on we're working with content developed at least in part by creators from scratch. And while that mostly applies to level modding, we've got a small handful of other mod genres to look at first, starting with control modifications. In this category, we have a trilogy of physics tweaks that were done to Monkey Ball's game engine. One doubles velocity, one maintains jump momentum no matter what, and one maintains velocity no matter what. As far as I'm aware, no ROM hacks utilize these control concepts, although I'd like to see something that could use these control schemes in the future. At least for now though, these three just amount to tech demos for future possibilities. Besides that, we've got three miscellaneous hacks to look at: Twix Ninja's Fun Mode, Professor Rain's SMB2 Encore, and SMB2 and SMB1 Style. The first is just a mod that changes the timer on the SMB2 Master Mode levels, while the second just retextures the SMB2 level themes. The other, however, is really unique and surprisingly ambitious, although due to its scale we'll actually save this one for the complete packs discussion, as it contains a complete challenge mode. For now, all you need to know is that it's extremely impressive in overall polish, but features an unfortunately common issue present in many of these larger ROM hacks: the Desert Heatwave bug. You'll notice on the ROM hack spreadsheet that one of the categories is widescreen compatibility, as SMB2's widescreen support is something that I regularly use whenever possible, as I'd assume you guys do too. Besides the SMB1 ROMs that don't support widescreen to begin with, all of the SMB2 ROM hacks at least partially support this feature. Besides most of the desert stages. This has to do with the desert heatwave effect built into most of the desert stages, which, regardless of what aspect ratio you're in, generates in 4:3 and stretches across the widescreen image if you're in widescreen. Fortunately, a gecko code has been developed that removes the heatwave in widescreen, so be sure to use it on any ROM hacks that natively have this problem. Alright, we've gotten all the other specialty categories out of the way. All that remains now is the meat and potatoes of the SMB ROM hack scene: custom levels. Of the 41 level hacks we'll be looking at, 19 of them contain only 30 stages or less. The mode of this strata of data comes out to 20 stages per hack though. In an attempt to go in some sort of functional order, we'll start with the shortest hacks and work our way up, and just go by release date for when ROMs contain the same number of custom levels. Without further ado, let's get going. Oh boy, what a way to start this section off. Okay, so this Romhack just replaces one of my favorite stages from Super Monkey Ball 2. 8 bracelets. I've mentioned this one before as a shining example of how good Monkey Ball can be at physics-based movement. But this wasn't exactly what I had in mind when I said that I wanted these design concepts expanded. 66 bracelets gives you exactly what you get from the name. And for what it's worth, it was pretty fun to boot up and just see that. Ultimately, though, it is just one gag stage I added to this retrospective purely because I got a laugh out of it. See, guys? I totally had a Christmas special planned for this year. Yep. All intentional. Anyways, as far as little novelty hacks go, this is pretty great. It's only 10 stages, but they're all pretty solid, even if the level theme is a little bare. It really does strike me as like the Christmas DLC things Sega used to do back in the Dreamcast days. Maybe if we'd gotten that Monkey Ball port, we would have seen something like this officially. Ah well, tangent aside, I recommend checking this one out. I'll be honest, I mostly like this one for the aesthetic alone. The idea of a mini-golf themed Monkey Ball world is such a categorically good idea for a game like this, I'm surprised no one else has otherwise tried it. Either way, this one is still a fun, albeit really easy, set of 10 short levels with a fun gimmick. My only complaint is a lack of a skybox, but I'm sure that'd be easy to implement. You could even use one of the ones that's already in the game and it'd be less distracting. Give this one a go. Yeah, I really don't have much to say here, considering I used like 12 save states just to finish the first level, then decided I had my fill. If you want ludicrously difficult stages, this is definitely a place to start. There'll be more like this that we'll look at later on as well, but try this one if you're into that, I guess. Monkey Ball Hyper is fine. It works as a perfectly functional set of 10 levels, plus one finished extra stage, but doesn't do much more beyond that. Campsite is the obvious standout level, but it falls into a similar trap as a lot of these ending exam format stages. I'll go more into that in the later Romhack though. Overall, this one's a perfectly functional, if perhaps unexceptional, set of 10 stages. Check this one out if you're interested. Not sure what happened with the skybox in the park theme. It might have just been incorrectly compiled on my part, but otherwise this hack runs perfectly fine. This one is a super simple 13 stage beginner set. It's got some fun stages like Banana Split and a good show of extra stages, but that's about it. This is probably the most in early development of all the hacks I'm covering in this retrospective, but nonetheless I decided to include it since the levels that it has are surprising in their ingenuity and their variance. You start with this creative use of jump pads commonly found in these ROM hacks for the use of a wall jump system. Then you get this massive sprawling level that I really wish there was more of in Monkey Ball in general. From there you've got branch work for a great maze level that rewards momentum, and confidence, which has a pretty interesting gimmick to it. I don't necessarily mean to oversell this one though, it is still in early development after all. I'd probably recommend you check out these levels in a more complete state via a later release, which may or may not be out by the time of this video's release. Nonetheless, I'm very impressed by what I've seen so far, and can't wait to see what else is in store for this one. Monkey Ball Vintage and World Tour, both by Amphi, are a reasonably solid duo of 20 stage packs, with both primarily shining in their extra stages. I especially like the use of essentially an 2-act structure within them. While not particularly cohesive between the two themes it chose, the idea of using Sonic Mania music, or any Sonic 2-act music in general, to emblemize its 2-act feel was a good one. It also has a handful of momentum-based stages, notably Staircase Chaos, which are just entertaining because fast. Monkey Ball World Tour is overall the weaker of the two in my opinion, but both of these are well polished for their time and have levels still worth playing to this day. This one is more or less a test playground for a few fairly unfinished levels. Some are good, some are bad, and some are just messy. Give this one a look if you are particularly curious, I guess. Here we go. From here on, we're getting into the larger scale and more recent projects. Bad Boon Strikes Back is a great setup, especially compared to most of the previous offerings. Very polished and good-looking levels. The difficulty is on par with a normal beginner plus extra sweet, with levels having accordingly rudimentary challenges to match. Orbits and terrain have pretty cool variants, but that's probably the most noteworthy element level design-wise. Where I think this one really shines, though, is in its aesthetics. I'm a sucker for Sonic level themes in general, so the latter two definitely get a pass, but man, the way the World 1 design changes for a time of day effect really does look great. This one is still in development, but nonetheless, I'd recommend giving this one a go, even in its current state if you're interested. Potassium Edition is particularly interesting in the pantheon of brutal Monkey Ball level packs. At first glance, they really don't seem like they'd be that difficult at all. Fend in particular encapsulates this remarkably well in terms of being just so unassuming, yet so ridiculously hard. For that, I definitely respect this one, but it's still pretty hard to recommend to those who aren't interested in crazy difficult stages. Here we have Monkey Ball 651's little brother, I guess. It's a pretty interesting set of 20 experimental levels. I prefer the first 10 for their comparative polish, but honestly, the extra batch has some more interesting gimmicks on display. Overall, it's worth a play, but keep in mind that these stages vary wildly in both difficulty and polish, so just keep that in mind. Again, not entirely sure what happened to the amusement park here, but if I had to guess, it was similar to the build error I experienced with Hyper. A Lion 8 Mies pack is yet another case of a solid, but admittedly unexceptional set of levels with a handful of highlights. To be clear, I'm not implying that any of these hacks are bad. I just have very little to say besides it's fine and it works, and to check it out if you like what you see. Here we have some more modern fare from a newer creator. While perhaps a little unpolished in terms of level design, the aesthetics here are very clean and upscale great. Definitely a plus in my book as an emulation user. Time Bomb is a fun wire stage, and I love the Rube Goldbergian former creator, even if it doesn't play all that great. Overall, just bear in mind that this one is still definitely early on, and as such will have some creature comforts. Now we have a particularly interesting ROM hack that made it here by the skin of its teeth, and, in my opinion, may become very influential to the future of Monkey Ball ROM hacking. 2 years after the last pseudonymous Christmas pack was released, user Dairoot assembled a team of creators to tackle a new holiday pack project. While currently 25 levels, with another update planned for this year, Merry Mayhem offers an impressive gambit of fun, unique, and even very ambitious level concepts largely thanks to its varied cast of level developers. This can cause some issues in terms of cohesion, and there are some signs of a slightly rushed development to get it out on time last year, but the overall level design on display here still proves to be a great time. Hekamecha, much like the majority of the ROM hacks we've looked at previously, achieves a very solid quality throughout its entire run, although unlike many of the past few, does manage to hold an identity of its own. Stages like Scarf and Roram not only have cool gimmicks and are fun to play, but now I also somewhat get an idea of the creator's style for design, something I've only occasionally experienced in the prior hacks I've discussed. The stage themes are really solid too, and further allow for this hack to gain an individual identity. I don't love every stage here, don't get me wrong, but I can say, with no reservations, that I can recommend this one. Last but not least, we have another newer pack, this time a demo from Killer Awesome. Of the 30 levels on display, the highlight is definitely Fortress and Escape Room, as in general the larger scale levels with more movement rather than static models tend to be stronger overall here. While the checkers and goalposts look nice, the otherwise flat shading and unpolished skyboxes do take me out of the game a bit. Hopefully these improvements aren't too difficult to implement, as otherwise this one is quite solid for its point in development. Well, that's the largest category of ROM hacks down. I know I was extremely brief with most of these releases, but there's two primary factors that cause that. One,
they're short.
And two, most of these are very early in development and or will be updated in the future. I'll look at them more when that happens, but for now, that's all of them. It's worth noting that these ROM hacks also had to deal with the nearly insurmountable challenge of showcasing one's unique style in a set of, at most, 30 levels. Even as someone who hasn't attempted it, I can see how taxing that can be, especially for a new creator. It would probably drive me to perfectionism personally. So, regardless of my comments on any of these ROM hacks, I have a great deal of respect for these creators and their ability to make a set of levels at all. Nonetheless, I feel compelled to offer my recommendations for the small ROM hacks you should check out, assuming you're new to the ROM hacking scene. The Mini Golf Pack, Bad Boon Strikes Back, Merry Mayhem, and Hekamecha are all pretty great, and easy to recommend due to the widely available ISOs for all of them. Although, you may just want to wait until this December's update in Merry Mayhem's case. Pinto Bean's TBD pack, Monkeys Need Hard Levels to Breathe 2, and Potassium Edition can also be recommended with their respective provisos. Everything else had most of their best levels ported to the 2020 Community Pack, which is also a perfectly functional place to start if you're new to Monkey Ball Romhacking. Overall though, that's it for small level packs. Alright, it's time to move into larger packs, and as such I feel the need to reiterate the difference between these and complete packs before heading forward, as I'll admit that it is the most subjective distinction in all of this retrospective. Reoncore, and even Hekamecha from the previous category, are technically both finished products from their respective creators. However, they aren't full game overhauls. Both only change one game mode each. So, while one could argue that these two are essentially finished products, the fact that they don't operate as complete game overhauls the way the other complete packs do, keep them out of that category. This means that if ever in the future there was a way to make only a single category accessible, both of their positions could be reconsidered. Cool? Cool. Perhaps the most underrated and least known of the larger packs, Fluppy's Monkey Ball is a 67 level pack, at least as of its current update, with levels covering beginner and advanced modes. Truth be told, this one's art direction is a bit too simple for my taste, even if it does remind me of Krabs' old skyboxes from way back, although it really isn't so much the focus of a hack of this scale. To elaborate, now that we're dealing with packs with a decent level density, more complex ideas like difficulty curves and reiteration of ideas can become important. And under these criteria, Fluppy's pack gets a pass. Its curve isn't steep by any means, as it stays in line with the difficulty of the original two games as beginner and advanced modes, with the steep incline that comes with expert mode not applying here. As for the modes more specifically, advanced is far more standout than beginner, with the former being much simpler level design characteristic of a beginner mode. It works fine to that end, but aside from the stages containing warp goals, they weren't all that memorable. There's also a reskin of these levels found in World 1, but the world style doesn't really suit the levels as well, especially for Raceway, so one could argue story is best off skipped in its current state. Advanced, on the other hand, contains some of the best levels we've seen thus far, in my opinion comparable to Hekamecha's high bar. Wobbly floor, hopping, and switches are all great ramp challenges that encourage speed and challenge air control a bit, although I would have personally switched stages 2 and 15 around to make the progression of this challenge a little more natural. Pencil Stroke is a super unique stage with a very inventive use of a warp goal path as an obstacle for the regular goal path. Slalom is a fantastic speed stage with a ton of potential for a harder variant, as well as benefit from a banana bunch past the goal, a la coaster or gravity slider, and every bonus stage hits it out of the park, capturing the best elements of what made Monkey Ball 1's bonus stages so great. Sure, the desert area is a bit of an anticlimax, having simpler and less inspired level design than previous parts of Advanced, but it's still serviceable right up to the end, where we sadly encounter a case of what I'm going to call arthropod syndrome. But this time it's honestly even more frustrating because of how the level concept plays with previously used mechanics. Combining a launcher with precise air control sounds like the perfect send-off for this particular mode, as both of these obstacles were extremely prevalent in this pack. So imagine my disappointment when this level is not so much a test in precision as it should have been, but rather a near uncontrollable mess. This mounted in me having to use additional lives to complete this mode, which was something I was expressly planning not to do for this pack onward if I could. But I digress. I'll also briefly talk aesthetics here, as I consider that the weakest link of this pack. Pretty much every background appears as a box rather than a seamless space, and not in a way that really looks intentional. The only one where it kind of works is in the second extra background, where it kind of adds to the warped aesthetic it's going for, but for the rest it ends up looking pretty dated and could definitely use a new coat of paint. Still, even though I certainly have my gripes with its ending and looks for it in beginner, Advanced here is still great, nearly on the level of Hekamecha. As for Advanced Extra, it's sadly incomplete. The ones that are there are okay, but nothing too extraordinary if you'd want to stop at Advanced 30. Even just considering Beginner, Beginner Extra, and Advanced, Fluppy's Monkey Ball still plays fantastic, and I can't wait to see what Expert looks like for it. Assuming development continues. Here we have the aforementioned Monkey Ball Ultra, a very promising ROM hack that, as stated previously, has been dormant for over 3 years now. In spite of its relative age compared to the other larger pack entries, on top of its future being somewhat uncertain, I've still decided to look at it here rather than later. Similar to Flubby's pack, Ultra fills Beginner, Beginner Extra, and Advanced, with Advanced Extra also receiving a complete overhaul here. In this case, however, the quality and look of this pack is more uniform throughout, with a fairly light difficulty curve compared to the originals to boot. This may have to do with the surplus of bananas present rather than the level design, but the result is ultimately the same. Getting to Advanced Extra is a very doable task without any extra lives, which is a definite plus. There are some oddities in the level order though, notably with the lack of warp goals in the final area of Advanced, while Advanced Extra has one. Besides that though, the level design itself has some awkwardness likely due to the limitations still present when it came out. Some stages have begun to use portals to help streamline and sometimes simply realize a level concept, while just as many, if not more, use simpler but ultimately less functional and play-friendly elevator platforms. This isn't to say that this type of platform is inherently invalid, but it's very rare for it to make more sense than a portal when comparing the two options in a given level scenario. Again though, a big factor in this is most likely age. I don't necessarily mean to overly harp on age here, but I do think it is worth noting seeing as it's by far the oldest being covered in the larger pack section, and one of the oldest being covered in general. As such, I can't argue that the overall aesthetic and especially the skyboxes have aged since they were new, but it is worth noting that much of the polish here was well above par for the time, and much of it even looks quite solid to this day in the same way some of Krabs' work does. Both extra level themes certainly deserve a facelift though, as they're both simultaneously really interesting and unique, and yet also the least polished in the game. As for the specific levels that inhabit these skyboxes, there are certainly highlights. Brook is a great looking level that plays fine. Funhouse and Treehouse are solid Marble Madness-esque courses, even if they don't necessarily challenge you on previous level concepts the way an exam type stage should in my opinion. Turtleshell manages to use very simple geometry to great effect, and Bazaar and Windmills both play well and tie into the sort of underlying creepy carnival effect this level theme can produce sometimes. Propulsion Drive is a top tier speed level, especially for the time. Buoyancy has a fun and unique gimmick that works well enough, and Gong, assuming the issue of knowing where the elevators are could be resolved via portals, makes for a great final level for Advanced. The last two extra levels, Rorschach and Hyperloop, are pretty top notch as well, with the former perhaps being the closest to a good flock stage that's ever been developed, for what it's worth, and the other being a pretty good speed stage. Don't get me wrong though, there are some duds here. Gearfisher is far too cool a name for a level this basic. Rain Chain doesn't tend to play very well, with the bowls being a bit too shallow to correct your movements a significant amount of the time, and the extra stages are pretty hit or miss in general. Truth be told, that's pretty high marks for a level pack released just a little after Monkey Ball 1, and it's still definitely worth a play, but there is something kind of off about it. Something that doesn't inherently have a whole lot to do with the pack so much, but more its context. Remember that Ultra, Banana Bash, and Dimensions all started around the same time, and in a way this pack feels like the cap off to a trilogy of sorts that looks less certain than ever being completed. Or more of a quadrilogy, I guess, if you count Monkey Ball EX, since that's getting an update soon. I do hope that one day we see Expert and Master as to complete the trilogy of sorts, but until then, I suppose that what's here is still worth playing. Back to the modern era, Monkey Ball Madness is another beginner and advanced pack, albeit this time with a handful of stages missing as of its latest release. Not to jump to this tangent for too long, but I'll take this opportunity to mention the Romhack spreadsheet I've compiled, as it contains all of the best variants for each hack that are currently available. Unfortunately, the same can't exactly be said for the Romhacks directory on the SMB Workshop, hence why I don't necessarily recommend going there first if you're new. Anyways, Monkey Ball Madness's beginner actually poses a pretty great challenge curve for new and experienced players. This is accomplished by having each level offer a streamlined and easier path, with either a complicated but intended skip, or alternative path being made clearly available for more experienced players to attempt. This may seem like pretty simple game design, especially for a platformer, but accomplishing this in levels as self-contained and short as most Monkey Ball stages can be extremely complicated and difficult. Even most official stages don't attempt it. Madness manages to do this with a pretty solid success rate, however, with the majority of stages having fun alternative options rather than being completely linear. The ones that are linear, though, are the weakest in beginner. They aren't bad, but none of them have contraindications to them having warp goal sections or even just intended skips. Take Kickers for example. The stage could totally have thinner, faster moving parts that contain green or even red goals, or if doing that would mess up level progression too much, maybe add a thin ramp that also acts as a conveyor. It's hard to stay on, but if you can stay on it, you can skip the last obstacle entirely, completing the stage considerably faster. These are just ideas, of course, But all this just goes to show that even the few stages here that don't offer these sorts of pathing could, if they were slightly tweaked. The best example of this sort of level design in action is Diversion Channel, which honestly was the first to make me look at these beginner levels with a more fine-tooth comb than I usually do. Both for that, and it kept being as fun to pull off as it is, it very well might be my favorite stage in the pack. Even the well-designed ones aren't all necessarily winners though, entirely due to their placement. Barometric is a great level that plays better than most of its ilk, but frankly Beginner Extra 2 is way too early for a level this difficult. By removing the button at the bottom that lets you kind of undo the gimmick, this has turned into a top-notch Advanced Extra stage. Ravine and Descent leave Beginner on an undoubtable high note though, leaving Madness with the strongest beginner mode we've looked at thus far, with the potential to make it even better as development continues. As for Advanced, it's also pretty well handled overall, albeit with a few more caveats than beginner mode. The return of gnarly options from the level jams is great to see, as brutal as that red goal may be. Beveled Maze is an above average maze level, and Torque, while a bit unintuitive for the average player to figure out the red goal on, plays just fine when going for the blue goal. Once you get to the Candy World though, the level design does become a bit more hit or miss. The carousels, even if it was placed a little too early, and Major Third, are both great levels, some of my favorites in the pack. Advanced Extra picks back up with some great speed stages and even a fun Groot Goldbergian level, something we don't get enough of in SMB ROM hacking in my opinion. Overall, I still somewhat prefer the stages in Beginner to those in Advanced, seeing as Advanced doesn't have as many of those dual option stages Beginner does, but both difficulties here really do have a lot to offer, with a whole bunch of new and interesting developments being made as we speak.
I'd also be remiss not to mention the bonus stages, as Madness contains one of the best ones I've ever played, Carnival Game. It's fast-paced, rewards momentum, and is extremely rewarding in terms of the banana totals you can get from it if you play well. The rest range from pretty good to forgettable, but still not bad at all as far as bonus stages go.
I'll also briefly mention Expert, as this particular demo uses that difficulty to show off some scattered ideas from across the game that have yet to be totally ironed out. They aren't exactly connected to what's contained in the other two modes though, so I'd suggest just going through Beginner and Advanced unless that intrigues you. Visually, Monkey Ball Madness shows signs of still being very much in the works. The first area looks pretty nice, and the first half of Extra looks similarly solid, but the rest are varying degrees of rough, with Bonus and Underwater perhaps being the most incomplete looking of the bunch. This isn't to say that any of it is garish or generally displeasing to look at, but I was glad to hear that much of it is in the process of getting a major facelift right now in development. All in all, a very promising pack. Alright, we've made it to the last of what I would currently consider the large-scale packs. Super Monkey Ball Re-Encore. You may have remembered that early on I briefly talked about this hack's predecessor, which just took the SMB2 level themes and gave them a completely new texture palette. It did this job well enough, but it ultimately does stop at texture changes in its scope. Re-Encore, however, includes 60 stages all to its own. Unlike you may expect though, it doesn't use Expert to accomplish this. Instead, Re-Encore uses the SMB Deluxe and 2 ROM to fill up the 60 stages in beginner mode. While that technically means this hack in particular has the least levels of any of the large-scale packs, I'd argue that it nonetheless has the most overall polish out of any of them. Every single background here is fantastic, especially the ones based off of Monkey Ball 1. The highlight is definitely Sky High, at least as far as I'm concerned, which through a small handful of changes magically turns into Sonic Unleashed Apotos. Really though, every single one of these is pretty fantastic. As for the level design held inside those level themes, they're now to a point where I don't think there's a single dud level, a wild improvement from the previous release of Re-Encore. The only time I experienced any issues in terms of level design was in Extra Stage 6, wherein the first ledge doesn't exactly telegraph that there's nothing behind it. Even a steeper other side that was tough to get out of would have been an improvement from what's currently there, but I digress. Everything else, even the particularly difficult ones, all makes sense. It's a solidity in terms of level design that comes very much appreciated, and is rarely seen in Monkey Ball. Solid really is the first thing that comes to mind with Re-Encore. It might not be my favorite in terms of level design, but it's all solid. Even if its level themes aren't built from scratch, they're still solid. Even the difficulty curve is solid, with the only stage being too early for my taste being Sinusoidal... Okay, screw this, I'm looking that up.
It just means sine wave? Just call it sine wave swerve. Okay, come on, Rain. I know you're a professor, but you don't have to teach me physics and geometry in a Monkey Ball ROM. Anyway.
Sinusoidal Swerve is placed a little too early, but it can be skipped via an earlier warp goal, so I suppose it gets a pass. Warp goals and banana placements are also well handled, leaving Re-Encore as one of the best and easily the most solid experience I've had thus far with a Monkey Ball Romhack. Well, that's all 4 of the larger packs finally covered. There are certainly a lot fewer of these to go through compared with the small packs, but even with only 4 to look at, it's pretty clear the differences that come with designing a larger Romhack compared to a smaller one. Even in Re-Encore's case, where it's all in one mode. Having double or even nearly triple the level count certainly allows for each of these to stand more on their own as individual experiences, rather than the more homogenized experience blasting through the smaller hacks often was. I can genuinely recommend each and every one of these for one reason or another, although in the case of Madness it may be worth it to wait until that final build comes out. For Flubby, Ultra, and Re-Encore though, I'd say you're safe to jump in and see what they have to offer. Almost 2 years ago now, way back when I first redeveloped this channel and hadn't yet gone down the enormous rabbit hole that is Super Monkey Ball ROM hacking, I made a double review of the original Super Monkey Ball 1 and 2. I'm not very fond of that review in hindsight for many reasons and plan to remake it at some point, but one important bit of info from that video was my early exposure to the franchise was only with Monkey Ball 2. Possibly my very first vivid memory ever was getting to the extra stages of beginner on my first playthrough at my aunt's house. I couldn't have been older than 5 at the time, and soon after found myself enamored with the game once I realized we had it at home. By contrast, I wouldn't play Monkey Ball 1 for more than about 10 minutes at a time until I was about 15 years old with access to Nintendo. Thanks to that difference in background, the differences between the two always felt rather stark to me. That's not to say that I didn't enjoy Monkey Ball 1, I enjoyed what I was playing well enough, but I always considered Monkey Ball 2 to be the better game for its greater ambition and lower barrier to entry for most people. Plus a greater sense of nostalgia for myself, of course. It wasn't until I finally gained a good enough understanding of the game's engine to complete Monkey Ball 1 without tool-assisted means that my position changed. Beating the original game's expert mode, and furthermore completing all of Master within the normally allotted lives, allowed me to see the true value of that quarter-munching, brutal yet satisfying arcadey feeling that Monkey Ball 1 had. Soon after, I found myself completing up to Expert on 1-3 Life Continue in SMB2 as well. I was surprised to find, however, that I didn't really enjoy SMB2's Expert mode nearly as much. At first that really confused me, but there happened to be one ROM hack that gave me both a greater appreciation and understanding for both SMB2 as a whole, as well as why I found myself enjoying runs of SMB1 more. That ROM hack is SMB2 and SMB1 style, the first complete pack we'll be looking at. Here we are, ladies and mentlegen, the complete packs. These Elite 12 ROM hacks have achieved the coveted position of transcending a simple collection of level replacements to becoming nearly completely unique game experiences simply utilizing the SMB2 game engine. Our first on this list, as well as the only one technically operating on stage concepts not strictly original to it, is SMB2 in SMB1 style. Now what do I mean by that? Well, as the name suggests, this one attempts to take most of the level concepts from SMB2 and completely redevelop them within SMB1's mechanics and art direction. Every stage has been retextured and reanimated masterfully within the world themes of SMB1, often being able to trounce the original in terms of sheer graphical fidelity. Seriously, wow, these animations look better than anything the official remaster added. It's nuts. There's so many minute details here that I just can't get enough of, like using the hitter goal in a beautifully reskinned dominoes, or how about folders and curvy options using Monkey Ball's amazing reflections. Synchronized being placed on an ice rink is also just endlessly clever to me. One of the best things about most of these complete packs is their relatively high production value compared to smaller projects, and this one is a fair contender for the best looking ROM hack to use any pre-existing Monkey Ball assets. I could probably gush about the impressive number of recontextualizations here for a tedious amount, but even doing that would be a disservice to the other elements of this pack. There's only a small handful of aesthetic blemishes to really speak of. A handful of the areas in the water background seem to behave a little off regarding the shimmer effect on the stage floor, and a couple of sky-high levels get awfully close to parts of the background that originally had collision in SMB1, but don't here. There's also one instance of what I'll call basketball floor in this stage for seemingly no reason. Honestly, it makes me wish more stages had it rather than it just being the one. Most notably though, the bonus stage lighting seems messed up in some way. Maybe reflections on the flat parts and translucence on the curves would have looked better? I'm not sure. Either way, that definitely could use some tweaking. Also, I really like the idea of making coasts refine like the ones in the background, but I wish it could start with the blue gradient like those do to better drive that concept. Also, the wooden texture for the outside is also kind of an odd choice. Using path checkers along the top probably would have been better. Switches and portals have also been removed entirely and replaced with remarkably solid execution of timers and more conventional automation. I was surprised by both the ingenuity and ability required to work around stages originally designed not just to use switches, but show them off. Sometimes this is done rather easily, like in Mad Shuffle, but other times you see stages like Catapult, completely redefining the way you play a stage like this to great effect. That isn't to say every recontextualization is positive, though. Remember how in the original Monkey Ball the extra stages were reskinned for every difficulty? It was a fairly underwhelming method of handling them, and made the extra stages feel less valuable as a result. For the sake of authenticity, though, this flawed at best design choice was preserved for 2-in-1. There's also some stages, notably Bead Screen and the Seesaw levels, that feel comparatively neutered compared to their SMB2 counterparts, and not in a particularly charming way like some of the others. Mad Rings was also one of the only stages in the pack that I consider an outright downgrade from its previous rendition. Those platform lips have killed far too many of my runs in Advanced over what probably seemed like an innocuous design decision. But for every dubious alteration or attempt to stay faithful to the original to a fault, another 10 or so stages are handled excellently, and ported to SMB1's overall format with an impressive finesse. There are some oddities that I'm surprised weren't altered though, even if they weren't intrinsic to the concept of this ROM hack. For instance, some stages can still be beaten just by holding forward, which is generally considered to be a result of Monkey Ball 2's rushed development, rather than being an intentional design choice. Also, I'm a little disappointed that we didn't get air hockey as a bonus stage. Puzzle being rebuilt as one of the best bonus stages around does make up for that a bit, I suppose, but it still would have been nice. Easily the change you'll feel the most as a Monkey Ball vet will come in the form of a completely changed level order. Choose whatever mode you want, they're all different. In Beginner, the shift in warp goal placement via the swapping of floaters and switches/tilt bridges, with the addition of a cleverly hidden warp on the former, allows for a beginner to really drive home the value and expedience of warp goals in a new player's mind better than vanilla SMB2 ever did. I'd go as far as to say that it does a better job than 1, perhaps being a debatably superior entry point for those just picking up the series than every official title. Needless to say, that's pretty damn high marks right off the bat, minus the mere 3 extra stages you get for beating it continuous. Advance offers its fair share of improvements too. The warp goal on Coaster is brilliant, even if the sheer height of the stage does show off some limitations of the level theme. And of course, Beta Arthropod is best Arthropod. 10 out of 10. 5 stars. Zag it! Clockface is a little tough for a stage this early, but those once again stellar visuals help me give it a small pass. Expert, largely due to the sheer quantity of levels involved, shows off the most when it comes to the changed level order. Catwalks is a great starting point, but man, Mad Shuffle is way harder in this version if you're going for warps. It's once you get to Ice that the differences begin to show a little more clearly. The order becomes pretty all over the place compared to the original, and yet simultaneously manages to offer a solid difficulty curve. There's a lot of Master Extra here notably, which only goes to show how unstable the level curve was in late game SMB2, that they fit so well here. Expert Extra removes some notable annoyances like Train Worm and minimizes the pain of air hockey by turning it into a hold-up. I would have preferred the latter be made into a bonus stage as I already mentioned, but this is still a more than acceptable change. Ending on Created By is similarly effective and works as a nice send-off. Also, using conveyors as a workaround for giving Master just 10 stages was pretty clever. I will say though, Master here is definitely the highlight for me. Jump Machine is basically a perfect encapsulation of what can make a project like this so great. It looks great, it plays just as solidly as it used to, and now enforces a new challenge using what was already there to grant it a new placement in the level curve. Cylinders on Crag is a little much to follow that up, but I know exactly why this spike was done. I think we all do. From there we get a stellar retexture of Passage, an improved Intermittent, and an effective use of Invisible for the finale. Also, finally getting to see these stages in a more befitting background is really nice. That's all I have to say about Master, though. Yep. Absolutely nothing else to see here whatsoever. And by extension, that's pretty much it in terms of the modes in this pack. While story mode hasn't been strictly blocked off in the most current release, it's obviously unfinished and by proxy dysfunctional. The only other thing I feel the need to mention is warps due to some oddities with them. See, in SMB1, warps did progressively less the higher the mode you were in. A red goal would skip 6 stages in advanced as opposed to 2 in expert, for instance. It makes sense that this function would be reintroduced, but I'm a little confused as to why it only works selectively. Sometimes green goals behave like red goals in expert for seemingly no reason. Whether it's through improved conveyance on how exactly these work, or just changing them to behave as is already expected, I hope this pack is able to be updated to accommodate. There's also a couple key stages that are completely skipped when taking the primary warps in expert. I can understand why Tears is skipped since that red goal isn't exactly challenge mode friendly, but Freefall? That seems like a strange cut, honestly. Depending on who you ask, Freefall or launchers are the stages that force the player to learn how to use the minimap. If anything, Freefall should be much earlier if you're planning to place launchers later in the game. Have this be Advanced 2 or something. Then you could switch it out for Eaten Floor and either cut that stage or swap some others around to make a solid fit for an expert stage. Even with those decisions in mind though, this is where we begin to see the full extent of what 2-in-1 accomplished within the expert's difficulty curve. Say what you will about the original Monkey Ball's ruthless quarter-munching format, but it undoubtedly achieved exactly what it was trying to do. SMP2 Expert always felt confused by comparison. It didn't feel solid but ruthless, with spikes intricately placed to maximize the challenge. It just felt haphazard? Master Expert is often pointed to for its lack of a difficulty curve, but 2-in-1 doesn't feel haphazard. Basically everything annoying about the original game has either been removed and replaced, improved to a stunning degree, or made totally optional. I genuinely have no complaints about it, so much so that I doubt I'll find myself going back to SMP2 challenge mode much at all anymore. It's largely thanks to that objective improvement that Spitz accomplished that I have a suggestion for this pack. Give us a modified Deluxe in 2 with these stages. Having all of the stages grouped together in a more aligned aesthetic, as well as more enjoyable when played as a challenge mode, could make Ultimate Mode a real treat. I know this would involve either cutting or retexturing the Deluxe exclusives to make them fit, but seeing a project of this sort expanded in this way seems like an interesting opportunity. The Deluxe stages are usually looked at in a similar way to late game SMB2 itself, so they could probably benefit similarly from a second pass. All of this is a suggestion, of course. I just figure that with Monkey Ball Randomizer well underway at this point, that this project wouldn't be asking for too much than that is already offering. Regardless, what's already here shows clearly that a great deal of effort was placed into making them all work in an ideal manner. Well, at least on emulator, that is. Another key aspect I have to mention is console slowdown. I only noticed it on Arthropod and cylinders, but it's very play affecting there. If you're on emulator, and most likely you are, you can just use an emulated CPU clock override to solve this problem. If you're on original hardware via ROM loader, however, sadly there's no recourse for it. Again, it's just for 2 stages though. So if I haven't made it clear enough already, Monkey Ball 2-in-1 style is amongst my favorites that I've discussed so far. It definitely offers the most to those, like myself, who wish the second game's challenge mode was structured a bit better. But this also has an intrinsic appeal to anyone wanting to revisit the classic Monkey Ball games. Its polish is up there with the very best, even beating Official in some regards. Oh, and it probably has my favorite beginner mode ever, so that's a plus. If you made it this far into a discussion of Monkey Ball Romhacks and somehow haven't checked this one out yet, fix that. You won't regret it. Okay, it's the day after New Year's 2018. NGU 2.0 has just dropped as the latest, and yeah, I'll just say latest, ROM hack to be released. That being said, tons of new work is being done all the time, and one creator in particular, besides good old Engu, has been making impressive strides in development. Initially released as the demo Super Alex Ball in 2017, creator Twilight would update this pack into something truly special. The Kickstarter of Monkey Ball Romhacking's 3rd generation. So without further ado, let's take a look at the one and only Monkey Ball. So, to wrap up our little history segment from almost an hour ago, what makes this the start of Generation 3? The obvious answer is to, just look at it, but I think we can go deeper than that. Levels can now have both a level background and level animations, something only previously done in a small handful of NGOU stages. Here though, the animations are able to fully shine thanks to more solid texturing work, as well as a stronger sense of purpose in their placement. Other notable new features include implementation of switches and portals for the first time. Their implementation wasn't perfect yet, but for a first attempt, it's not half bad. And finally, we have those level themes. I mentioned them last, as I would consider them to be, at best, on par with what Krabs accomplished 2 years prior, but that's still a step up from all contemporaries. The only exception is World 9's background, which hasn't aged hardly at all. If this came out today, it would still hold its own against modern work. For a pack that just turned 4 not too long ago, that's very impressive. But that's not the only trailblazing aspect Monkey Ball would introduce. It would also be the first full release to be entirely built on story mode. This concept of centering the game around this particular playstyle would continue to another 2 pretty important ROM hacks you may have heard of. As such, we should definitely see a difference in the way these stages are made as compared to most of the previous and more challenge-oriented packs. It's in World 2 that Twilight really begins to present more of their level development style. Almost everything here presents you with a totally optional work goal. These goals, just like in vanilla story mode, don't offer anything to the player besides more points and usually more bananas along the track. With few exceptions, none of them behave as faster exits to the level. This is kind of an odd choice for a story-focused pack, but the levels here do all play well at least. Mouse holes is probably the only stage I can say I didn't like here. World 3 almost acts as a total 180 in terms of game feel though. Warp goals are much rarer again like they were in World 1, and the level design becomes a bit more experimental. The shifting back and forth between Vanilla 1 and 2's game feel is a little jarring, but in these early worlds every stage tends to be very short, so it doesn't have too much time to sink in, especially on your first run. World 5 is where the experimental level design hits its height until near the end of the pack. There's a lot of weird concepts that make much more use of animations and stages that require at least a read-through or 2 of their patterns to get down. These learners act as the first pushback most players will get in Monkey 1, but even still, World 5 doesn't overstay its welcome or overdo it on the difficulty. The polish present in the last 5 worlds starts to diminish once we get to World 6. There's still some fun stages here, but a lot more in terms of easily cheesed and perhaps unintentional quirks in the way the game runs. Game animations also seem to have some occasional judder to them. This problem can be annoying, but I'm willing to assume that it was just a limitation of the release time more than anything. Later packs only exhibit this trait on particularly fast and repeating animations from what I can tell. World 7 shoves us back to a more SMB1 feel again after a bunch of mostly SMB2-esque experimental level design. Most of it plays well at least, but this is the first time that the shift in feel was actively noticeable while playing even on my first run-through. It wasn't immersion breaking per se, just a bit of a head scratcher to me personally. This was all done by one person, remember, so it's odd to see fluctuation in level design philosophy like this. Also, some of these just do not play well. Even once you figure them out and do it consistently, the slightly off collision they occasionally have can be a real pain. Then World 8 is back to more experimental stuff again. It's also the second difficulty bump I actively felt. That's not a negative though, the shift in feel here almost makes the shift in design style a little easier to take in. Although what is going on with this disc level? The last one from World 6 was way too easy to cheese, but for this one I can't even really tell how you're supposed to play the green goal path, unless you could go with the precise edge clip the way speedruns handle it, but for a more casual and safe strategy? Yeah, I've got nothing. World 9 throws quite the curveball by being made up predominantly of classic SMB level remixes. These harder variants come out of nowhere, but I'm actually quite fond of a lot of them. It also proves that there was merit to extension and enhancement of some of SMB2's level concepts. This SMB1-like expansion on previous levels to SMB2 stages was a fun surprise. Oddly enough, it was the only aspect 2-in-1 style itself didn't add. It's a little weird that they're just sort of tacked on here at the end of the game, but I'm willing to bet it was predominantly done in service to the difficulty curve. Some of these can be a real time sinker first go around, much more so than previous worlds. Recorder and Wasp Hive were the highlights for me, based off of Expert 47 and Beehive respectively, and as already stated, they get to be in the best looking world in the entire pack by a pretty wide margin. Following up World 9's curveball, World 10 still manages to be perhaps the most confusing of the bunch. There's a not so great combination of neat concepts and major jankiness mixed with less than stellar conveyance. Besides World 6, this world feels the least thoroughly tested in the pack. The difficulty curve is also just a little all over the place. It's all at least as tough as the last world, but man, brackets and culmination are way tougher than everything else here. I mean seriously, who thought this goal was a good idea? This should be a meme goal, not the intended and only way to beat the stage. And if that weren't enough, Lust is probably the worst stage in the pack. If the bowl was a little more shallow and spun a little slower, it would be much more enjoyable and all-around playable. As is though, I'd honestly say you're fine to outright skip it. The likelihood that you'll get lucky at the end of culmination isn't terribly high anyway, so you probably won't be clearing World 10 unless you have an exorbitant amount of time and patience for that alone. It may surprise you to hear that I actually like World 10. In spite of some serious weak points, this one actually has some great stages in it. I'm especially a fan of Shriek for its Wavemaster-esque rhythmic movement, and the 2 exam format stages here are honestly the poster child of how to do them right. Every obstacle here is one you've encountered on your journey already. You've become accustomed to all of them, but you've never had to complete a gauntlet of them. Here we have that done in a very satisfying way, almost entirely making up for World 10's shortcomings in my book. Every exam stage should take notes from these 2. Monkey Ball is quite an impressively diverse adventure, all things considered. I suppose that in some ways that should be expected for the first pack of its kind. Monkey Ball is a roller coaster of ideas and concepts that maybe don't gel together. That's kind of okay. This was an experimental leap forward for SMB ROM hacking, and it shows. It's definitely flawed, but it's clear that a ton of passion went into it. Maybe that's why it received a sequel so soon after, although it was really a sequel in name only. Just 8 months after the release of Monkey Ball 1, an extensive rework of the pack would be released to address some of the weak points of the original game, as well as add a challenge mode. Before jumping into that, it seems more apt to do a more apples-to-apples comparison of story mode, though. World 1 has almost been totally reskinned with a brand new background. It's okay. I mean, it's nice that it's original. The old one was based off of some Smash Bros. Melee assets, but the new one isn't anything too crazy. Also, there's only 2 stages carried over from the original. Others have been shifted around to both beginner and the early worlds, but it's still odd that Monkey 2 starts so differently and becomes more and more similar to the previous as it goes along. Worlds 2 to 8 are all mostly the same, just with some trimmed fat and some mostly pretty solid level replacements. I say mostly due to the many cuts that I'm kind of disappointed with. Ribbons, pyramids, twirl, parenthetical, and blossom were all cut, and I wouldn't consider any of those fat. And why was Peekaboo kept? That was the fattiest of fat in Monkey 1 and continues to be since it was left out of challenge mode. The one place where it could have been justified in earlier expert as a quick banana grab or something. Confusing decisions were made all around here. Oh well, even with those cuts I would have preferred to not have happened. There's definitely a handful of great stages here that are entirely new to the game. My favorite of these is definitely 12 Bracelets, even if it took me a very long time to understand it fully. But stages like Deconstruction, Down and Around Hill, and Control are all noteworthy new inclusions. That being said, Footworms is easily one of the worst executed ideas in the pack, and I have no idea how it made it into the final build. World 10 continues the odd changes from earlier and ramps them up considerably. Patience combines Unboxing and Tiltwire, both of which have been kept as individual levels in challenge mode as well, plus some fast direct trade-offs and a tiny but rushable corner cross. Then there's Well-Rounded, which remains the same from the first 2/3 but has Lust, perhaps the worst Monkeyed 1 stage, tacked onto the end in a pretty silly looking fashion. Needless to say, I'm not a fan of this decision. If you really wanted to make Well-Rounded harder, it would have made much more sense to add bracelet rings or even funnels maybe, not this mess. Dark World has also been moved, but confusingly retained its name in spite of being in the brightest background of the game now. Yet again, it probably sounds like I disliked World 10, but I still managed to enjoy the majority of it. Nonetheless, it's clear that Monkey 2 wasn't exactly a definitive edition of story mode. Overall, you at least gain about as much as you lose on top of an overall cleaner presentation. As for which you'd enjoy more, I honestly say it varies quite a lot from person to person. I enjoy Monkey 2 more as I don't find footworms too infuriating, and I don't mind skipping the World 10 parts I don't enjoy on repeated playthroughs. If that's not really your style though, or footworms is that much of a sore spot, you'll probably enjoy Monkey 1 more. In any case, give both a try and see from there what better suits you when it comes to repeated playthroughs. Of course, this only goes for story mode. Monkey 2 also includes a challenge mode to look at composed of almost 1/3 of its own stages. And how did they fare? Well, yeah, I'm not a fan of Monkey 2 challenge mode. It looks great. The vanilla level themes suit most of the levels very well, but most of the exclusive content here really isn't that great. Beginner, Advanced, and Expert all contain 10 more levels than vanilla SMB 2, but to be honest, I think this extension was the wrong move when looking at what's actually contained in them. There's only one bonus stage that holds up in terms of visual fidelity, and another two that I'd say are enjoyable on repeat playthroughs. This doesn't help an already confused banana system that makes using them as a reward distinctly more difficult, and indeed often isn't done well here. Besides that, you only start encountering a larger collection of stages exclusive to challenge mode in late Expert. Advanced also has a few, but most of them don't even play well. Most egregiously, there's a pyramid stage here way less interesting than the one from Monkey 1 that was cut from 2 entirely. I really can't understand what the thought process was here. Bridgemaker is cool, but considering it's the only stage that sticks in my mind from Advanced, this makes me wish that it was in Story instead. Expert, mostly thanks to having 60 stages to work with, has the most original content by far compared to Beginner and Advanced. I'd go as far to say that if you're planning to check this one out, you can skip Beginner and Advanced entirely, and just play Story and Expert for the best experience. It can be ruthless, especially if you're trying to go for every red goal on the best route, but it can be satisfying to conquer. It can also get pretty frustrating compared to most packs that contain challenge modes, so be wary of that as well. And as for Master, it lives up to its name. Monkey 2 Master is a worthy successor to the classics, even if it can be more ruthless than both of them at points. Only one stage is a freebie. Everything else poses a brutal challenge, especially when limiting yourself to the intended number of lives. Most of it keeps up the tough but fair play of the classics, but does occasionally break those rules. Why is this wire here in Master 6? It doesn't gel with the other obstacle here at all. And on top of that, we haven't even played this game's Master wire test yet in the run. And Faith is just silly in design. There's literally no reason to play it intended. It's much easier and nearly as intuitive to just fall down onto the bottom platform. This especially felt like a gun punch to me because of how many stages were like this in Monkey 1 and were improved in 2. Why is this one like this if every other stage with this problem was changed specifically because this was a problem? It's beyond confusing, but at least it doesn't take up much playtime. As long as you can disregard that blemish, Master here is actually really good. I'd say that of the challenge modes anyway, Base Master is the best out of all of them by a considerable margin. But as you probably know, Monkey 2 isn't really known for its base Master stages. Monkey 2 Master Extra is fascinating to me. It's not just difficult, it's cunningly so at points. I actually think it was done as some kind of inside joke Twilight pulled on all of us. There's no way stages like Coil, Hook, and, I quote, "oh screw this," could exist if it was meant to be anything else. As such, don't expect to complete this mode within the stipulated lives without speedrunner levels of experience and multiple hours of dedicated practice. My run spent nearly 200 lives on just Hook and oh screw this alone. I really can't consider myself a fan of these, even as someone who enjoys some pretty tough levels. I've been really critical up to this point with challenge mode, but I don't mean to be overly incendiary here towards Monkey 2. I get the appeal here in a lot of ways and it definitely has its fans. Some, like Eucalyptus and Spitz, actively prefer it to Story. I don't agree obviously, but I do see it in spots. Honestly, if Twilight had decided to just go the route of keeping the base levels the same between Story and Challenge and make the extras unique like vanilla SMB2 did, I think it would have worked much more in this pack's favor, and I'd have a higher view of it. It really should have been shorter altogether as well. Maybe even a 10-20-30 split would have been better. Were there a more scalable way to retool the bananas as a reward system, I would also have a better view on it. Even solving those issues isn't going to save Master Extra though. For most people, I'd recommend just playing Story mode. And if you end up really enjoying it, you can give Expert, Expert, Extra, and Master a try. If you don't end up caring too much for story though, Compact 2020 has got you covered on anything else from Monkey 2 that's definitely worth your time. So to bring things back to positives after a mostly negative look at challenge mode, story mode in either Monkey Ball is really a good time. It's not perfect, but the execution and polish in reference to the time it was made is a real accomplishment. It also paved the way for other creators to step into an entirely new era of Romhack development. It's gotta count for something. And even though my position is pretty lukewarm now playing all that I have of the original games and other more recent Romhacks, I can imagine letting a lot more slide had I known about this when it was new. Again, these were packs that came the closest to Monkey 2's polish at that time. It's understandable why it made the waves that it did. Now, being aware of just how important Monkey 1 and 2 were to the community at large, it might surprise you to hear that Twilight ultimately developed very few Romhacks afterward. 2 were small packs we already looked at that operate as a short beginner set and a cutting room floor for the Monkey duology respectively. The other 2 projects were somewhat quiet releases by comparison, mostly because they were abandoned after Twilight began development of their fan game. Kaizo Monkey Ball would use Monkey 2 Master Extra as a blueprint to produce a swath of the hardest stages ever devised. One is even impossible. It was cancelled after 7 mostly finished worlds, and as such largely exists as an oddity for speedrunners to occasionally dabble in.
I think Kaizo's still got like some genuinely good level design on a lot of the stages, and it just takes that like good level design and just like propels it super far into like the super difficult realm. And I don't know, I'm a pretty big fan of stages like that.
I think it kind of knows that it's not supposed to be fair, and that's what makes it charming, in my opinion.
It's got that Kaizo spirit.
Yeah, it's got that Kaizo spirit. It's not a fair, fun to learn Kaizo. Or I mean, you know, it might be fun to learn, but it doesn't feel fair. But that's what makes it fun.
I had a lot of fun playing both of those. Like, I love stuff like that. Like, really, really stupid stuff in Monkey Ball.
I don't know, like Kaizo gets me angry. Because it's just unfair. There's a lot of stages that are just hard, but my honest opinion is that it's okay because it's labeled Kaizo. It's meant to be unfair. In the Kaizo setting, it's totally fine.
Ordinary Monkey Ball acts as a hard mode / New Game Plus overhaul of SMB2. It never got far into development, and most of the challenge just comes from taking chunks of geometry out of the levels. But it is a fun oddity if nothing else. If the Kaizo interests you, I'd recommend looking at Twix Ninja's Monkeys Need Hard Levels to Breathe series and Nambo's Super Monkey Ball Supernova for a more modern experience. If you're interested in ordinary Monkey Ball, Brandon SMB's begun his own project restoration of it. It's a ways away from completion, but should scratch the itch for those who enjoyed the original and or want a more modernized take on the concept. As such, I'd say both concepts are in better hands now than perhaps they ever were. And of course, because I'm sure there are people wondering how much I was going to mention it, I am aware of Rolled Out. I even bought an early access copy. As for when I'll talk about it more, get back to me when version 1.0 hits the scene. Looking holistically at Twilight's work, it's clear that their impact on the ROM hacking scene can't really be understated. There's a reason I consider Monkey Ball 1 to be a generational trailblazer that sparked so many of the small pack projects. It showed people just how good backgrounds could look now, how good animations could look now, how clean and high poly level geometry could be now. To put it simply, it set the bar for what it meant to make a Monkey Ball ROM hack. And it set it pretty high considering the limitations of the era. But even so, it is, at least partially, hard to recommend. Unless you're extremely determined to play everything, it's probably best to just stick with story mode for both packs. It's also worth noting that a pretty massive texture overhaul is in the works for Monkey 2. That project is also a ways off from release, but unless you're in a rush, I'd say that it's the version you should play in Monkey 2's case. With that being said, go check out Monkey Ball 1 and 2 if you haven't already. It really did set the bar. When talking about Monkey Ball ROM hacking, and really ROM hacking in general, it can be easy to forget how many of these projects are only done by one person. Whether it be a pack as small as a 3-stage demo, or quite literally the pack with the most individual levels out of any of them, basically all of these have one forerunning member of their team, the level designer. These days it's also pretty common to also have someone helping out with texturing and lighting, since that's become so advanced now in its own right. But that's usually it. That's all there is to packs besides maybe a handful of guest levels and technical help. This one-man band approach to making things can have benefits, most notably that it allows for a remarkably uncompromised vision from the level designer. However, there's one massive cost that comes into frame with a project of that sort. Time. Time in a medium like ROM hacking where standards and quality are constantly going up, as new improvements are made seemingly month to month at points, can become an overwhelming challenge to face. Just think about working on a pack before Monkey Ball came out, only to now be expected to reach a much higher standard. Then have that happen again when Gaiden comes out. It can reform the way a hack looks and feels entirely after long enough, especially if the early releases of it were also published. In this environment, 3 ROM hacks were forced to evolve in the tumultuous Wild West that was early SMB ROM hacking, and yet somehow managed to have final releases that were up to par with their contemporaries on scale if nothing else. While one of these 3 developments would be left largely as a mystery, the other 2 would be very public in form. Those 2 are Super Monkey Ball Dimensions and Super Monkey Ball Banana Bash, the next 2 complete packs up for discussion. Welcome everyone to this special double feature edition of the Complete Packs discussion. And really, when you consider every public build of these, it actually comes out to 7 for Shattered Reality and 5 for Banana Bash. That's 12 for those playing at home, and yes, that is also the number of complete packs in this entire retrospective, coincidentally. For the sake of overall brevity though, we'll only be looking at the most recent builds for both in this discussion. I might mention an earlier build here or there if it did something noteworthy that the current release doesn't do, but otherwise we'll just be looking at Super Monkey Ball Dimensions Shattered Reality and Super Monkey Ball Banana Bash Remastered. Let's start with the latter. Banana Bash has a major through line within it that makes it difficult to recommend past a single playthrough. Quantity over quality. See, Cherem did successfully make the single largest Monkey Ball Romhack out of the entire bunch. 16 worlds and 20 original level themes can be found in the complete story mode alone. There's also reworked vanilla backgrounds in some stages to further variety. And if nothing else, the pack does have variety. Quite a lot of it, honestly. Just not necessarily the kind of variety that rewards multiple playthroughs. Yes, having 20 custom world styles sounds impressive, but that aspect is diminished when backgrounds like this are used less than half as often as backgrounds like this. This only gets more confusing when looking at both water themes. One of these is clearly more ambitious and sticks out from the others with more compelling levels. Wouldn't it make more sense to merge these into one world by taking the best parts of both? Having a more dedicated mechanical level theme would also be super useful. It's pretty common in the level design throughout and yet never really gets to shine, at least aesthetically, because they're stuck in kind of ill-fitting environments. The only one that they could somewhat fit in is underutilized for this, and even there it isn't exactly perfect. If you cut down the fat that exists here exclusively for variety and high quantity, you'd see a massive improvement stylistically. Regrettably, this quantity over quality aspect is present in every part of BBR, not just level themes. To be clear, BBR does have a lot of good levels. No matter how cynically anyone wants to look at the way this pack was made, it's undeniable that Cherem made a lot of solid stages here. I go as far as to say that he hits the mark a good 2/3 of the time. If he just took those and maybe polished them a tiny bit more while he was at it, I'd be able to recommend this one without issue. As is though, you're dealing with about 50 levels worth of filler or old ideas that just don't work very well. Even the better worlds like World 7 still have stages that wouldn't have felt out of place in a build of this ROM hack from 4 years ago. Most of this is harmless in a bubble, you might not even notice it on your first playthrough, but the more you play this, the more you'll begin to feel the filler bog down the entire experience. It honestly makes me wish that the entire campaign was consolidated into one ISO. This would also require a rework of the password, I'm aware, but Gaiden was able to make a similar system work, and even the Infernal mode included in the Windows expansion operates on similar rules. Even if it wasn't used for more story worlds, I could totally see the system in place for story being used to unlock Infernal mode or something. I even just thought of a fun gimmick where you have to pick from all the stages and guess the correct one in a list of buttons, but each one actually has the puzzle piece contained within it. Unless you played story, you wouldn't know which was accurate. This also plays into the riddle aspect in a fun way and could likely be accomplished with minimal effort. As for what to do with Master in this conceptual 1 ISO setup, It could be reworked into a modified Expert Extra, or have them cut and left the story exclusive levels to keep Infernal mode somewhat intact. This condensing process could be expanded further by rebalancing Beginner, Advanced, and Expert mode to all be comparable lengths to ease the difficulty curve and better show off the challenge mode friendly level design. As for the old archive, it could still be kept as a 100% bonus for completing Infernal mode, and still be maintained on a second ISO. Also, and this might seem odd and or obvious to mention, but you have bananas everywhere. The life system here would be more forgiving than in just about every other pack if implemented normally, and yet instead we just have a death counter that only serves to completely devalue the main gimmick of the pack. I feel that needs reiteration. Monkey Ball Banana Bash, a game which heavily uses bananas in the level design per this gimmick, offers you nothing for collecting bananas. At that point, what even makes challenge mode different from story? Why wouldn't the entire game be built around story if you're fine with using multiple ISOs? Challenge is a much less convenient format when used outside of its wheelhouse. There's no reset button, there's no stage select, it only works as a marathon experience that no longer exists here. Why is challenge mode even here if there are no lives? Again, this was probably done to minimize difficulty for such a long pack, but you can't just cut the core component of challenge mode over that concern. You could keep a steady difficulty curve just by starting the player with 5 lives on the base ISO like Monkey 2 did, and allow them to buy the rest after playing through story mode. As is, any traditional life challenge isn't even doable in BBR without awkwardly keeping score yourself. And that's just not what challenge mode is about. So for a quick rundown of what I've covered so far, BBR is just a little too big for its own good. Its scale is impressive, and the idea of BBR acting less as one sustained pack and story, and more as this big anthology of individual worlds, is genuinely interesting. But that would only work if each world was given more focus and paid greater attention to in its level themes. My biggest hope for this one is that we get a heavily trimmed down Banana Bash Kai at some point, but until then, I can only recommend this one to dedicated completionists of each Monkey Ball Romhack, doubly so for the Windows expansion. The rest of the highlights from this one can be found in the community packs. Alright, time for part 2 of this double feature. Super Monkey Ball Dimensions, Shattered Reality. Right from the beginning, it's clear that Dimensions doesn't have the same issue of quantity over quality that BBR does. DSR makes use of a single ISO with a normal 10-world campaign. Some stages are left as challenge exclusive, but that's it. In all honesty, I'd say that both of these have about an equal amount of good stages and concepts. The only difference is the amount of unnecessary content that's also present. That's not to say it has the edge in every area either. Besides a couple standout level themes, I'd even say that Banana Bash is the better looking pack. It is pretty odd to me though that, for both hacks, the fire level was the serious sore spot in terms of graphical fidelity. At least the World 2 checkers are nice in DSR's case. DSR also takes more advantage of higher speed levels. In general, tougher stages reward more daring tactics that are very speedrun friendly. Needless to say, this was a breath of fresh air coming right from BBR to this. Dimensions also has one very cool trick up its sleeve: ghost platforms. These might be my favorite gimmick ever introduced by a ROM hack, and it's taken to full effect throughout the game. These start appearing in World 3 in small doses and appear more and more as you play, but don't become the center of attention until World 5. And on World 5, it's probably the most praised out of the entire pack, and I can see why. The level theming is inventive, if a bit old looking now due to an 8 skybox, and the use of ghost platforms feels more at home here than ever. Most of the level design keeps up the pace the game has set up to this point too. I think my only big complaint is that the ghost platforms weren't introduced here and taken more advantage of overall. The ones that are here are great though, and this is definitely the highlight of the game overall. Once you start hitting DSR's late game, notably World 8 and 9, you broadly feel the game start to slow down a bit. The level design is taking a more mechanical approach starting here, and to be honest I can dig what it's trying to accomplish. It feels a bit odd going from the speed-oriented game we've had up to this point, but for what it is I think it works for increasing the sense of difficulty near the end of the game. The aptly titled Dimensional Rept further strengthened this point with a particularly interesting send-off. These assorted level themes were really fun to look at, and the exam format being applied to each world at the end was honestly pretty ingenious. The only issue I have is the wires, and honestly that's a problem all throughout the game. It may have been caused by the way DSR was tested, but overall I feel like traditional wires here were always a grade tougher than everything else around them in terms of level design. World 2's rep has this problem here in spades, but besides that, the curve between each challenge is great. We end on the titular stage Dimensions, a fantastic and impressively speedy level that acts as a stellar story mode send-off. Clearly DSR gets a lot right in story mode. That ending portion with the more mechanical heavy level design wasn't a perfect shift from the speedier early game, but still managed to hold its own pretty well. It's not like it totally came out of nowhere either, to be clear. The only problem is when those learner stages make their way into challenge mode. DSR Beginner and Advanced are perfectly fine in this regard, to be fair. They do everything I could ask of a challenge mode of this sort, and I'll likely find myself coming back to them pretty routinely. Expert, on the other hand, is a little more rough around the edges. I'm just not a big fan of the stages in Earthworm Gymland here, at least for challenge mode. But otherwise I really don't have any complaints besides the very uneven banana placement. Master is also pretty good on its own. Not necessarily 3 life challenge friendly, but neither is Vanilla Master in either game, so that's fine. You can still buy lives as well here, so it's not a big deal. It's examples like the life system that make me wonder if some of it comes down to the creator's mentality. Banana Bash has so many levels that are either in dire need of updating, or simply need to be left in the archives. Dimensions feels as if it was able to understand when to cut an old level and when to go that extra mile, and for the most part I really think it paid off. There's so much less wasted space here, largely thanks to the more compact form factor. Put it into the most poignant of terms, if the Mega Maze had originally been made as part of Banana Bash and not Dimensions, I honestly think it'd still be there in the modern build, with little or no change. It's a shame too because of how much BBR shows respect for its roots in the Windows expansion. It's so nice to have all of this history be so easily accessible, but it can also show that besides the visuals, not much has changed for some of these older builds compared to their newer counterparts. DSR doesn't actually do this, partially because a couple builds are currently lost media, but hopefully it can one day get similar treatment. I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention Monkey Ball Universe Final Mix, the pack that succeeded Dimensions' lengthy development. While technically outside the window of this retrospective, it acts as an extensive, story-centered remix of the contents of Shattered Reality. It's similarly recommendable in spite of the greater difficulty spikes within it compared to Dimensions, but I'll talk about it more another time. Throughout the Complete Packs discussion thus far, we've discussed many projects and the lengthy development cycles required to get them to the polish they have. With the last two, we even saw development cycles that spanned entire Romhack generations, and the way that impacted them. But one option I didn't consider was simply trying to outrun the breakneck progress of Monkey Ball Romhacking's early days, releasing a handful of packs during each era. But of course that would be absurd, right? With all the limitations that were present back in the day? No way. No one would be capable of producing that quantity of levels. And yet, here we are, talking about a guy who's done just that for reasons beyond mere human comprehension. NGU, the man, the myth, the legend. I have to admit, tracking NGU's legacy has been a pretty big conundrum in terms of writing this portion. On one hand, he's created a bunch of pretty impressive individual stages and assets for his time that were definitely influential on some level. And on the other hand, there's the other 70% of his work. On top of that, it's not exactly a secret that much of his work carries over content from his previous packs, and ultimately results in the more modern entries having whiplash into older material that just don't gel with the small amount of new stuff added each time. This itself is a result of NGU's release format, which is much different than it appears at a glance. I was actually pretty shocked at the revelation that NGU really only has 6 ROM hacks that introduce a significant amount of original material. NGU 1, Arcade Edition, R1, NGU 1+2, NGU 3, and R2 Challenge Mode. That might sound like a lot, but remember that NGU has 15 packs out there as of making this video. My theory is that the other releases, and even R2 and NGU 3 to some extent, act less as wholly original packs in their own right, and more as haphazard updates, given names seemingly at random. You can track their lineages and quickly find that the shared content seems to come less from outright laziness and more from just a very misguided approach to continual updating of his work. Dozens of stages from NGU 1 and Arcade Edition, his first 2 packs to include custom levels, still continue to receive minute, if even that, alterations with each passing release. In all honesty, I think that a process like this makes sense during the really early days of ROM hacking, when massively useful tweaks came out so often that just redoing your work could become worthwhile. By 2019 though, there really wasn't a point to handling updates this way anymore, if there ever was to begin with. It's also led to quite the confusingly complicated legacy. First off, 3.25 itself arguably shouldn't be counted at all, as in hindsight it was just a demo for R2 with a slightly better ending, sharing very little to nothing with 3.0. Second, NGUU 1+2 takes more from NGUU Arcade than it does from NGUU 1 or 2. It does also have some originals, but most of them were either duds or made it into NGUU 3. In hindsight, 1+2 probably should have been 3, or maybe even Arcade Edition 2, and 3 probably should have been 4. And that's really just the surface level of insanity this release format caused. If there's one suggestion I can give to future explorers of Monkey Ball Romhacking's early days, it's to never try playing all of NGUU's catalog in one go. Worst mistake of my life. Regardless, after all that insanity, the only NGUU packs I believe deserve any real scrutiny, at least for this discussion, are NGUU 3 and R2. 3.25 is just a demo for R2, albeit a good one. Arcade Edition and especially NGUU 1+2 showed up very, very late to the party in terms of technical aptitude, and his Compact 1.0 remake is outside of the time window of this retrospective. If you want an idea for what some of his earlier stuff was like individually, I recommend Pseudo's stream highlights for when NGUU 2 was fairly new, or maybe this run highlights video I did for NGUU 1. For the discussion proper though, let's just go in release order. NGUU 3 is the single most polished NGUU pack out there in terms of looks. It's well textured, well modeled, and well animated. In terms of sheer functionality, it's his best work, and up there with vanilla Monkey Ball 2. In terms of playability, it's okay. The biggest issue this one has is pacing. You might not feel it as much on your first playthrough, but repeat runs of NGUU 3 can feel painfully slow at times. Many stages have blocked off skips for basically no reason, and others require extremely slow movement just to progress on the steep geometry. It also has the problem of virtually all of NGUU's work before the release of R2 Challenge Mode, vast reuse of levels from a bygone era. At least Master and Master Extra are pretty solid and include a lot of new content, a rarity when looking at NGUU's earlier and later track record when it comes to difficult stages. Accordingly, I mostly just recommend this one for Master. The rest ranges from fine to bland, but definitely playable. R2, though, is significantly more divisive. R2 was a pack at war with itself. When it comes to the main three challenge modes, R2 acts as the best set of levels NGUU has ever released. True, Expert, Extra, and Master are both pretty scuffed for many reasons, but Beginner and Advanced are genuinely really good all around. I think the shorter length and greater number of entirely new stages help make this one stand out so much compared to both his previous work and in general. In many ways it stands as a great pack and unequivocally NGUU's best, barring the ending. Until you look at Story Mode. Story Mode in R2 is NGUU's worst pack since at least 1+2, possibly since 2.0. It's unpolished, its stage order is nonsense, its difficulty curve is nonsense, and very little here is original to NGUU. It's basically a combination of the worst parts of NGUU 3 and the worst parts of 1+2, and as such I recommend skipping that section entirely. It's almost as if every NGUU pack has some sort of monkey's paw built into how it's constructed, some catch within its framework that stops me from being able to recommend it in totality. The closest to overall solidity is 3, and even there it's at the cost of pacing. In an ideal world we would have R2 Challenge Mode with NGUU 3, Expert Extra, Master, and Master Extra rolled into one release. Then I could recommend that banger Challenge Mode and could look forward to NGUU doing something entirely new in the future after finalizing all of his older work into a both modern playing and modern looking release. As is though, NGUU's library remains staggered in quality and vast in quantity. In many ways it gives me a greater appreciation for BBR's quantity woes. It never got even close to this overwhelming. Just look at R2's Story Mode. Sitting right next to the best challenge mode NGUU ever made is his worst story mode since the widely riffed on NGUU 2. It's fascinating to see so many levels made with a modern understanding of the game that are enjoyable to play in one mode, while the other exhibits the exact opposite. It almost feels as if they were designed by two different people. It makes you wonder why. why develop packs in this manner? If you want to do one big release that's continually updated, do that. There's precedent for that. If you want to do something new with each big release, that's cool too. Just don't add a bunch of older stages to pad out the game. 3.25 and R2 show that a shorter campaign is totally fine as long as the levels are fun. The world may never know NGU's reasons for releasing things as he has, but it's fun to theorize, right? Just ask Pseudo.
The Never Giving Us Up Cortex, which is a system of computers buried deep underground somewhere underneath Alaska. Yes, Alaska. It does what it will so that stages can be released as fast as possible. See, of course, if you don't want to believe the whole conspiracy of the NGUU Cortex, there is always an alternate theory you can subscribe to, which is that NGUU, whose name is Chris Brown, is just the singer Chris Brown. He beat Rihanna, and now he challenges you to beat his pack.
Well, I know some believe either one of these, and to break from the memes for a second, I could actually believe that this guy is secretly developing some kind of machine learning tool for Monkey Ball levels. I offer a third theory. I believe that NGUU is none other than Junichi Morita, lead designer of Super Monkey Ball Banana Splits. Think about it. This game has been completely wiped from all discussion by the greater series during the Banana Mania trailers. That's a fate only shared with the N-Gage port, besides the mobile and browser games. It was placed on a doomed system, so that no one could enjoy the best Monkey Ball level design since the classics in terms of official release. Wouldn't you attempt to somehow take revenge by flooding the world with as many Monkey Ball stages as humanly possible? And in a more accessible way at that? Even after going through the hundreds of stages made by dozens of creators, including almost all of NGUU's, I still haven't played Banana Splits, due to its rarity and inability to be emulated. In a way, no tactic would be more deviously effective. Of course, that doesn't explain the propensity for Monkey Ball Adventure stage ports and early NGUU content, but that's just to throw you off the trail. And for any of you saying, but Logan, NGUU has spoken in a still public video and he doesn't have an accent or speak another language besides English in that video. How could that be? Easy. His voice was deepfaked. Easy to do with modern technology, I might add. I'm on to you, Mr. Morita. I know you're the mastermind. But in all seriousness, I can't be too hard on NGUU. He's made plenty of mistakes over the years, but he's also made some stages that I would legitimately call great. And credit where credit is due, I really like the portals from NGUU Arcade Edition and would like to see them return someday in new levels by both him and others. They're a little small, yeah, but they have a more clear outer collision and shape that makes them feel much less frustrating in play in my opinion. Hell, I'd go as far to say that NGUU has the better bird stage.
Excuse me, what?
His older work is also fun to look at for many of the same reasons packs like Gold and Platinum are. They act as a great time capsule for what ROM hacking for Monkey Ball looked like just 5 years ago. I think there's something to that for those willing to explore it. As for what the future holds for NGUU, I'm really not sure. The dude's output quality has fluctuated about as much as it is possible for one person to do. But even if the next patch we get is more or less the same as we've already seen, I do think, or at least hope, we'll get another pack made up of entirely new content from Never Giving Us Up 2055. Or we'll get another 95-degree drop. Either way, I'm sure it'll be at least a little interesting. In the world of difficult Monkey Ball stages, you'll tend to hear most of the same works being brought up. Monkeys Need Hard Levels to Breathe, Kaizo Monkey Ball, and most recently, Monkey Ball Supernova. Each one of these packs exists as a dedicated release of some of the most difficult Monkey Ball levels ever constructed. And that release structure is no accident. Unless you're a speedrunner or a very high level player that could definitely be a speedrunner if they wanted to, stages of this sort probably don't interest you very much. I mean, try to imagine a complete campaign of Monkey Ball levels designed to end with content resembling that of Kaizo Monkey Ball. Could that even work? We saw a snippet of that with parts of Monkey 2 Master Extra, but that wasn't meant to be taken all that seriously. Is there a way to make a natural feeling difficulty curve for a pack that ends on some of the toughest levels ever devised? Well, the thing is, there is one other name that gets brought up in those discussions. Super Monkey Ball 651, World 10. 651 has such a fascinating legacy to me. It was such a groundbreaking pack for its slew of impressive innovations, and yet is mostly remembered for its ending world and little else by players at large. Even the discussions I've personally had with people when it comes to 651, almost exclusively revolve around World 10. So as an ode to those achievements from the other 90% of the game, let's take a comprehensive look at what Monkey Ball 651 accomplished, starting from the top. Right out of the gate, Monkey Ball 651's structure was in and of itself influential. Though Monkey 1 technically only had a story mode to speak of, and Monkey 2 maintained a focus on it, no final form of a pack up to this point had truly been designed to take advantage of story mode. And yet from the first go, 651 absolutely nails its early game. It's up there with previous highlights like 2-in-1 Beginner, Monkey Ball Madness Beginner, and early Re-Encore, but playing to the strengths of story as opposed to challenge. World 1 especially feels so distinctively fleshed out for this early on. In a sea of beginner-focused packs that struggle to gain an identity, we see Scrap do that before we even get to the stuff that most people know him for. The larger nature of most of them also allows you to really get a feel for each one before jumping into the next, something often missing from World 1 and beginner levels, even in official Monkey Ball games. I wonder if the larger checker size Scrap employs affected that. World 2 continues the trend of large yet tightly focused stages with a great speed stage as well as 2 great tutorials on the different types of jump pads. World 1 had a stage with jump pads in them too, but it didn't force you to learn about how exactly they worked like Funhouse does. World 3 brings its own share of obstacle training. Corner block, slicer, and gyration are all fun timing challenges, and waves acts as a fun spin on the wire choice formula. As far as story modes go, they don't get off to much better starts than this. After the early game training for different obstacle types, 651 spends the next 4 worlds making extremely good use of the freedom story mode offers you, in many ways focusing on puzzles that I'd actually feel bad for spoiling. Part of what makes this section of 651 so great is the ability to mess around and discover the secrets of these stages yourself. The benefits of story mode's infinite lives function is taken at least as much advantage of here as it was in vanilla Monkey Ball 2, if not more so. That alone is a huge accomplishment, but the other point I've neglected to mention thus far is the overall production value. When it comes to fully custom backgrounds and making stages that play off of them, Scrap is undoubtedly at the top tier. Shiny grass aside, I love the way each of these first 5 backgrounds look, and love the way that each stage incorporates itself into the background even more. It gives this greater feeling of immersion to the first half of 651 that rivals the classics at their prime. Once again, that's a pretty huge accomplishment, even if it doesn't reflect in the second half nearly as much. And then there's World 6. If it wasn't for World 10, this is probably the first thing anybody would think of when they thought about 651. It reminds me a lot of Dimensions World 5 for its use of an iconic obstacle brought to its logical extreme. In this case, portals. While I still consider NGUU Arcade Edition to have, in most respects, the best portals out there, there's no doubt that Scrap's use of them in the level design is more creative here than ever before. Minus steps. Admittedly, conveyance is an issue in drop-in as well. It's really unclear how you're supposed to do this weird 90-degree transfer followed by a sloped corner cross to hit the button. It's all sorts of unnecessary awkward even when you figured it out, and I think some pretty mild design changes could have easily made it clearer and improved the stage a ton. If it weren't for those two, this world would undoubtedly be the best so far, which is nice since World 7 is about to pump the brakes a bit in terms of overall innovation and graphical fidelity. To get this aspect out of the way, World 7 is the weakest looking part of the game. It's far from terrible, at least being on par with Monkey 2's better backgrounds, but it's stuck between 2 of the best ever made, so it's going to feel underwhelming. It also has some weaker stage offerings too, but I think this is mostly felt because of placement rather than anything else. I think it might have proved better if World 6 and 7 were swapped altogether, but even within the bounds of what we have, it does have a few standout stages regardless. Gravity Jumper is especially fun. It makes me wish we had more stages out there designed to send you soaring like this. It's an effect only rivaled by the height of physics platforming in classic Sonic, but even in that example the feeling isn't as exhilarating. World 7 also plays the least into its world gimmick besides World 8, but considering that was just icing on the cake for this pack's presentation anyway, I don't consider this to be much of a problem on its own. As for World 8 itself, it's an odd one. As I mentioned earlier, its background is up there with the best, and it has a lot of great stuff in it, but this is where 651's previously very steady level curve totally breaks down. Overcorrection is way trickier than anything prior, and it's just a particularly tough stage in general. More sidling practice stages from earlier on would have helped this a fair bit, but I do think that regardless, it should have been swapped with an easier World 9 stage. And then on the other side of the spectrum you have Beams, which is extra bizarre not just for having an early game difficulty, but also having aesthetic choices that wouldn't have been out of place in World 2 either. Why is this so close to the end of what most people will be playing? The stages that hit the upper end of the spectrum of difficulty do work great, but as a whole it does still feel very wonky and even disjointed. That overall feel doesn't stop at World 8 either. For that reason and many others, I feel very conflicted about World 9. It marks a big delineation from the rest of the game, as even at the highest level of play, it and World 10 are considered to be part of a separate category from the rest of the game. As you would expect from such a delineation, the wonkiness of World 8's difficulty is felt here, but cranked up a notch overall. On the too easy end we have Network, the stage that probably should have been switched with overcorrection to help mitigate the confusing curve. And on the too difficult end we have Ladder. Ladder sucks. It's often a very frustrating and tedious stage, packing both frustrating collision, exceptionally high precision requirements, and an obstacle format you've never even dealt with up to this point. It's a shame too, since had this been swapped with World 10's easier level, World 9 might be more broadly accepted as part of the more accessible category. And that would have been great, because without it, you have what I think is the best world in the entire game. Elevator, stream, picture frames, pacing, distortion, as much of an oddball as it is, they're all great. Lava River and Platform are even better and just so fun to pull off once you get the groove of them. Technique, brutal as it is, weak in conveyance as it can be while figuring out the ideal position, is one of the very best stages that I've ever played from any hack. The only fault that it has is that there weren't more stages like it that preceded it. It's actually crazy how much World 9 gets right. It's just that Ladder ends up taking over the discussion more often than not because of the time sink it continues to be for everyone who regularly plays 651. In a lot of ways, World 9 itself is just a microcosm of 651's legacy as a whole, forgetting the other 90% of stages because combined you spend less time on them than the other 10%. Just looking at the math from my first full run of the game start to finish really illustrates this point. Before I'd even touched World 10, my overall playtime was about 2.5 hours. Not an impressive time, I'm aware. I spent quite a bit of that just messing around on stages trying to get cleaner runs of them for video B-roll. I also had to figure out some parts of them for the first time. After clearing all 10 stages of 651 World 10 for the first time though, my total playtime was 5 minutes shy of 15 hours. Keep in mind that while I was chipping away at that, I did another recorded playthrough of 651 on emulator that also lasted another 2.5 hours. Even combining those together and rounding them up to the nearest half hour, I spent a third of my time proportionally on 2 runs of Worlds 1 through 9 as I did on a single run of World 10. When looking at it from this time sync perspective, World 10 eclipsing 651's legacy makes total sense. It's what people spend the most time on, assuming they bothered with it in the first place. But that's just it. Very few people who have played 651 have actually beaten or even seriously attempted to play World 10. And it's considered totally acceptable to stop at World 9 as a normal player, even by those at the top level.
I like to tell people that World 9 is like, you know, if they're playing 651, pretend like World 9 is like the actual end of the game and World 10 is like bonus content. Like, there comes to a point where I feel like something is just too much. And 651 World 10 is very much that for most people.
But how can that even be the case? Sure, the stages are extremely difficult, but with enough time, surely anybody could figure out how to beat them using purely the game itself, right? What makes World 10 so disconnected? I believe that the reason for that earned reputation, as well as the reason that making World 10 as hard as it is could have never worked as a proper ending, comes down to one thing: the limits of a casual player's intuition. Besides Stress Test, the states that could have been swapped with Ladder, the chances of these being beaten by a player who has zero speedrunner assistance is slim to none. To be clear, by assistance I mean anything from recorded runs that you could conceivably go off of, to direct assistance in a voice call. And that slim to none caveat also really only goes for 3 stages. The only 3 that even have a chance of being beaten by a normal player are Birds, since you have a small chance of just getting lucky on the collision like I did here, Crank, assuming that someone has either been playing quite a bit of 2-in-1 like I did, or somehow thinks of the long tours and new parts challenges entirely on their own to practice an easier version of the cycle, and Unlock after a pretty massive number of tries in determining the best route. Even in my case, I only did one of these 3 without assistance. The other 6 though, I don't see any casual player doing those entirely on their own. A fair few people asked why I didn't do desync earlier in my run, and my answer was always that I wanted to see how many of these stages could conceivably be completed by a player with an ordinary skill set and no outside assistance. And ultimately the answer for desync was that it couldn't be done with just those things. There is no conceivable way to determine the cycle on this stage just by studying the pattern. You just have to know it from somewhere else, or put in an incalculable amount of trial and error. Smile and frame windows both require some pretty specialized movement a casual player is unlikely to ever intuit. The demand on speed control just feels very awkward, especially if you're new to the movement like I was. Exam 651 is similar, although this one is definitely the most bizarre in terms of the intended strategy. Up to this point, you've had a few stages illustrate the type of oscillating movement you see in Exam 651's RTA strategy, leading me to pick up that strategy before seeing anybody else complete it. I was shocked the first time I saw Scrap's official run of Exam 651 for this reason. Nothing really tells you that such a strategy makes the most sense here. Sleek Copper HD is one that I mostly consider uncompletable entirely without assistance due to its infamous ending wire. This slightly off-kilter and uphill inclined monster will end almost every run that manages to reach it while learning the stage. It's stupidly hard, and I would have thought that my successful run at it was a bit of a fluke if it weren't for a previous time over where I pulled it off up until the last stretch. It is possible to get used to once you have the necessary information, but like most of World 10, there's no lead up to this sort of obstacle anywhere in the game. And lastly, for both my run and for the game, there's Antlers. And Antlers I think acts as a microcosm of World 10 as a whole. As a concept, it's brilliant. The idea of using these swaying U-curves is so cool, and it plays cool too at first, but because this is 651 World 10, it had to end on one of those swaying curves that's only a 0.1 unit thick. For players who are mostly just experienced in vanilla, that's the thickness of the warp goal wire on Advanced 11 for Monkey Ball 1. Now imagine that instead of a straight line, you have to land on that from another fairly thin wire while they both sway at high speed. It's crazy, and like most of World 10 intended, completely untenable for the average player to pick up. The RTA speedrun strat, similarly to doing birds with the IL strat, is actually easier, more practical, and more reliable even when you aren't speedrunning. The difference is how likely a person is to even figure out Antlers RTA on their own. Accordingly, that leaves more than half of World 10 completely untenable without assistance. It's worth noting that even if you are a speedrunner with top-notch skills in Monkey Ball, you still aren't likely to ever get desync without Scrap's original playthrough to go off of. But that's it. Assuming you're willing to put the time in and take up those complex strategies from outside sources, 651 World 10 is beatable. If your goal is to just experience these in a largely casual sense, simply intuiting the stage in front of you and figuring it out based off of previous mechanics, then you should probably look elsewhere after World 9. Even for stages that can theoretically be beaten by a normal player, it's hard to call any of the stages in World 10 besides Stress Test casually completable. They require a pretty exceptional amount of time to even complete with help, much less without it. There's something undeniably different in the level philosophy once you cross the threshold of intuitability, and World 10 crosses that more often than it doesn't. For that, even as someone who has finished the entire thing and did enjoy parts of it, I can safely conclude that World 10 isn't necessary to get the 651 experience. In some ways, I actually recommend experiencing it separately from the rest of the game if possible, through separate sessions and sittings. That being said, I wouldn't call World 10 terrible, even if it is undoubtedly flawed. I actually consider some of them to be great stages on their own. Smile is pretty cool once you understand the movement, same goes for Exam 651's RTA strat. Ultimately, I also think that the crossing of the threshold of intuitability was largely unnecessary. Similarly to Antlers, most of these stages would be much more approachable in a slightly more forgiving form. Wires don't need to be this thin, mostly, but I think other signifiers could also help with completing these stages. Maybe if time trial ghosts were an unlockable in Master to show you how to complete the more confusing movement challenges? Regardless of how they were made more understandable, the point remains that in their current state they should have never been the ending to 651. As for why they are, I think it mostly comes down to the attention the World 10 stages draw to someone who's mostly just played vanilla. If that was the reason though, I think that World 9, had it been the final world, would have accomplished the same effect while not harming the legacy of the pack. Also, had the Gaiden route of hiding the endgame been a thing back then, we might have received a very different endgame for 651. Of course, that's a topic for later though. I think the last key element of 651 I have yet to bring up is the music. As you've been tipped off to a bit by the way each track has been credited throughout this video, Super Monkey Ball 651 is, to this day as of recording, the only Monkey Ball ROM hack with music created specifically for it. Though version 1.0 of 651 used random bits of party game music from Monkey Ball 1 and 2, the current and final update of the game did away with this reuse in this regard, and instead implemented music by artist Jim Nopedi. 7 of the tracks were made exclusively for 651, 2 others were tracks made by Nopedi beforehand and fit their respective molds. And lastly, World 10 was a remix of Soft Touch by Willing. As for how the score works in-game, it mostly works very well. Most of the tracks take the disco and house influences of the Monkey Ball score and chill them to perfection. Sometimes. When it comes to the more chilled out environments like World 8, it really works, arguably just as well if not better than the more bombastic feel of the classics. For World 10 though, I don't really think it's a great fit. It does suit the environment beautifully, I'm sure that's why it was picked, but these stages demand something with a little more punch, or at least something a little more portentous like Vanilla SMB1 Master. Monkey Boat Expert, the old stand-in track for World 10 in the early build, accomplished that to a much greater degree in my opinion. This is final world music. This is music for around the World 5 mark. The big exception to this overall feel is Exotic Volcano. This track has that final level punch I just mentioned. It does feel a little different from the rest of the game as well, mostly taking cues from the classic N64 sound fonts. Leave the Lava Land comparison aside, it really suits that final level feel for those stopping here. Just another reason to do so, I suppose. The track also has a great conclusion that was cut from 651 for looping reasons, so I recommend checking that out after you're done either way. 651 is quite the curiosity to me. I've certainly gained a greater appreciation for it over time, especially World 9, and I am satisfied to say that I've conquered each and every bit of World 10 at least once. Overall though, I don't blame anyone for stopping at World 9. All I recommend is that wherever you stop, you don't rely on save states to do it. Do it legit, and you won't be disappointed.
Schrodinger's cat is a rather famous thought experiment. It involves a cat being stuck in a box that also contains a chemical that has an exact 50% chance of killing it. Is the cat alive, or is it dead? The answer Super Wagar Monkey offers is that there is no cat, and Schrodinger's a fucking schizophrenic.
Super Wagar Monkey is the greatest Monkey Ball ROM hack of all time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to brag, but I put together a Lego set in a week, and the box said 2 to 4 years, so I consider that an accomplishment.
I'm gonna be honest. I think Rail Grinders from Dimensions is one of the best stages from that pack. Welcome back to the Complete Packs Retrospective. As you probably noticed, this one's pretty short. In truth, there's little to talk about with the community packs. They're showcases of everything we've already seen, minus the last one we have left to talk about. The only major point I have is rescinding my point with 2020 during the small packs discussion. After experiencing all of the complete packs by this point, I can safely say that you should experience the complete packs and even larger packs like Re-Encore that interest you first. Then, to get a taste of everything you're less interested in, just play Community Pack 2020 for a best of collection from other people's mostly ongoing work. When it comes to Community Pack 1.0 and 1.5, it's mostly just old levels that only have appealed to fellow explorers of the Monkey Ball hacking community's early days. That is, for their original renditions. A fascinating aspect of Monkey Ball's hacking community is how committed they are to consistent updates of the past. Community Pack 1.0 alone has seen multiple modernization projects start and stop more or less since it came out, with the only one sticking being a basic implementation of skyboxes where there previously were none. And even then, that wasn't exactly implemented masterfully. Also, a pro tip for future explorers, Community Pack 1.0 is also just known as Custom Pack 1.0 inside both the game and on most download links. It isn't made super clear that the two are one and the same, unless you know to check the wiki. But in case there was any confusion, there you go. Community Pack 1.5, as far as I'm aware, did not carry this over. Community Pack 1.5 itself also had at least 2 major attempts at restoring it to something more modern and approachable. Those 2 attempts became 2 publicly available versions, 1.5 HD and 1.5 DE. No, this isn't some sort of weird time delineation. It simply resulted from the trend of most people calling their modernized levels HD for quite some time in the Monkey Ball community. Even though on original hardware they still do run in standard definition. DE stands for Definitive Edition, in this case earning that title. From what I've played, there is zero reason to go back to 1.5 HD now. Virtually every change 1.5 DE made was for the better, and successfully allows for the ambitious vision of modernizing a pack that was originally so ambitious in its own right. It also had inadvertently made most of the 1.0 restoration projects obsolete, since 1.0 and 1.5 shared so much content to begin with. Ultimately, 1.5 DE holds the very unique and esteemed position of being an accessible way to explore some of early Monkey Ball hacking's achievements, without the usual sacrifice in polish and playability that entails. And that's a great thing to have. It also looks phenomenal. But that's it really. 1.5 DE is a cool way to experience some old levels, and Compact 2020 acts as a great sampler platter after you've played the stuff that interests you most. They're straightforward in their purpose and value, but no less impressive and important. Both come highly recommended for anyone to pick up and run through, at least once. Also, I'm going to be factual, Row Grinders from 1.5 is a stage from that pack. You jump directly from one set of gutters to another, which is a reference to something. It also has the jump which has the player rebounding off the wall to ramp the jump. If you've heard of any ROM hack of Monkey Ball before watching this retrospective, anything at all, it was almost certainly Super Monkey Ball Gaiden. To many, it is the Monkey Ball Romhack. It acts as the most common gateway to the modding community, has received publicity on a scope significantly greater than any prior work, and to this day remains very popular among speedrunners of ROM hacks. It even has a following within spaces that almost exclusively revolve around official installments. It's the only release that has any sort of public precedent in terms of critique or review. For most creators and speedrunners alike, it's their go-to favorite, and in many ways, the core of what I had to say about Gaiden isn't far from expectations. Its polish is second to none, approaching an overall fidelity that rivals what AV themselves accomplished, even exceeding it at points. Its use of more complex objects like switches, portals, conveyors, and even the Romhack original jump pads is all rivaled by few on any one of them, and by none for the whole suite. And of course, Gaiden's sense of scale is unforgettably impactful. Just one look at stages like Battle Royale or Colossus and immediately you'll be able to tell that compared to both vanilla and previous ROM hacks alike, the scale is on another level here. But there's so much more to Gaiden than those surface level aspects. So as we've done with the 11 complete packs before it, let's take a look at each part of Gaiden in greater detail to better understand just how it became the community icon it is today. World 1 of Gaiden is probably the most intricate and difficult opening world of any pack with a coherent difficulty curve. I'm aware that isn't saying much, it's suitably easy after all, but it lays out its levels in such a way that feels surprisingly light on fluff, and isn't afraid to throw in a couple curveballs even this early on. Similar to the sharp opening of 651, Gaiden is able to present its early game with a surprising degree of focus. It can also just be surprisingly tough, even compared to most packs' second world. Meanwhile, Gaiden World 2 has a couple snags that could easily trip up people who've only experienced the official titles. It sends the message before you even make it to World 3 that Gaiden's early game isn't going to be the cakewalk you see in most Monkey Ball early games. And once you hit Dungeon Hall, this effect is only emboldened. Gaiden even throws out its first big puzzle challenges like Ringfield and Battle Royale here, 2 levels rather well known for, slightly different reasons. Also shout out to I even said Acudal Guillotine, goddammit. Also shout out to Actual Guillotine for being superior to the old Guillotine in both concept and, pardon the pun, execution. World 4 is... wait. Oh no. Brazil! World 4 continues the difficulty curve and slow building sense of scale by introducing perhaps Gaiden's biggest innovation for basic level construction: animated conveyors. Tug acts as a fantastic introduction to the obstacle, and Emitter makes good use of both normal and counter conveyors for an effective speed stage. There's also foreshadowing for the heavily layered and compacted level design of late game, with Diaphragm and especially Turbine. Turbine also acts as the longest level up to this point by a considerable margin, behaving more in line with an exam stage with a solid execution of centralized rotational movement. Considering all of the moving parts, it's impressive it plays as well as it does, and feels fittingly placed. Crystal Mine is where Gaiden gets its cheekiest in terms of puzzle solving. Dragonfly is definitely an easy level to get stuck on if you don't pay attention, as Ludwig can attest.
Okay. Ah! For fuck's sake! Some direction!
It also doubles as the start of a trend that Gaiden will keep for almost its entire second half, the beginner's trap opening. Drop of Doom also comes with its own cheeky opening jump, albeit one very useful to speedruns, and Jumpflex does some unique things to target bounce pad abuse. For those unaware, bounce pads that aren't animated offer a greater jump height when used repeatedly. If unaccounted for, this can easily result in level design that's particularly prone to exorbitant skips. Jumpflex plays with this effect in fun ways, albeit with some pretty thin wires thrown in too. Easily the most complicated at a glance is the hectic maze awaiting you at the end. Warframes takes a very similar approach to many stage builder levels, acting as a choose-your-own-adventure pathway. Just looking at those examples, you can guess that World 5 probably contains the least conveyance of any Gaiden world. But besides Dragonfly, all of them can be pretty easily understood with just a handful of plays. There's also some fantastic speed stages here to break up the more technical and puzzle-oriented side of the world. Range and especially Perimeter are both some of the best stages of their type, both for Gaiden and in general. And then there's World 6. I don't usually talk about music when it's not original to the Romhack, but I gotta hand it to Kutzman. Nightwalker by Raito for Under Night and Birth has to be one of, if not the, single most fitting non-Monkey Ball track I've ever heard for one of these projects. If this isn't Monkey Ball side story music, then I don't know what is. City Skyway also carries the second beginner's trap for newcomers with Tripwire. Finding the rhythm on this one can be pretty tricky, especially if you haven't played similar stages in previous packs. Circus can be a little difficult to manage as well until you understand the fast cycle, and even then, it can feel a little wonky. World 6 is also home to my least favorite stage in Gaiden, Seismic. The collision here is just non-existent sometimes, and I can't for the life of me figure out why. It's a neat staging concept, but it needed a little more time to work as consistently as it should. Sakura Grove is where you really begin to feel the heat in terms of difficulty. Ikaruga continues the trend of acting as a wake-up call to start off the world, but this time it's followed up by levels of comparable difficulty. Most well known for this world is Phantasm, many other people's least favorite stage in Gaiden. And in terms of execution, I can definitely understand why. The concept of banana conservation is great in my opinion, but the placement of them here isn't always the best. That, and it's very easy to clip the tilt bridge in ways that are almost impossible to correct for. I'd say most of the issues could have been solved by turning Phantasm into 2 levels, probably in separate worlds. As is, the most frustrating part is having to do the easy part over and over while you blindly charge into the second. I'd still say Seismic's wonky collision is more of an issue though, but one weak level, as well as one far too easy skip, doesn't stop World 7 from still being great. Upstream might be my favorite looking level outside of World 9 for the way its color choices suit it so perfectly, and Focus Breaker's tricky implementation of thin wires matched with jump pads is very well done. Gaokao is also a solid ending obstacle course. World 8's overall aesthetic and feel is top notch all the way through. The more mechanical level design and greater implementation of buttons serves the world brilliantly. And once again, the choice of music is on point for similar reasons to Nightwalker, and to a lesser extent World 9. It's kind of odd how much more climactic this space colony feels than the real one from Vanilla Monkey Ball 2, but here we are. There's also some minor graphical details here that I think were mostly just bonuses of the way Monkey Ball 2's engine already worked, but are still great. For instance, the way the spark trail from the section you were just on is still visible after leaving it on gradient descent is such a cool effect. Gyroscope carries a similarly small inclusion while also being the highlight of the world visually. Visionary is a very ambitious level creator stage with a ton of variance between its options. Perhaps most famous of the World 8 stages, though, is Raids, and for good reason. Outside of some of the wonkiness of button collision inherent to Monkey Ball 2's engine, this one is a stellar showcase of them, all in sequence and fitting in great as a part of the level theme. By the time you hit World 9, the scale has already grown past what every other Romhack or official stage has done before. And once you're really into the thick of it after 3 fairly easy openers, the sense of scale receives a huge bump once again with a killer level theme to go with it. Once you hit Strum, the world really gets going. Strum's unique movement feel sets the tone for much of the remaining world, which maintains a priority on unique and ambitious animations. Antagonizer even packs 3 entirely new ones into one level. Axel and Fallout Zone make use of their own unique movement challenges in fun ways, but all of those pale in comparison to Lightspeed, Apparatus, and Colossus. Lightspeed in particular is the single greatest speed stage ever made. It's damn close to perfection. It even manages to incorporate an enormous shuttle loop that actually works. As far as I'm aware, this is the only time any attempt at a manual shuttle loop in a 3D game has even worked close to this well. It doesn't feel totally perfect, but in lieu of what came before, it's stunningly impressive. Apparatus is one of the longest stages in the game, acting almost like a Metroidvania title in its progression and does so almost perfectly. The only issue is the bridge to the goal's placement not being totally clear. Colossus more or less acts as a warm-up for what World 10 will be throwing at you, and does it in the form of a boss fight against a robot packing both a sword and a machine gun. Is it a little too tough for World 9? Oh yes, definitely. But I think it does work as a finale for World 9 when looking at what World 10 has in store. As for why it isn't 9-10, yeah, I got nothing for that. This or Lightspeed, the world is called Lightspeed Warp after all, really should have been the end, as cool as Apparatus is. World 10 begins, like the majority of the worlds before it, with a pretty brutal beginner's trap with Exodus, a septiplex obstacle course with some of the most unforgiving trade-offs in the game. Pandora's Box doesn't let up much from there with difficult to track animations and complex backtracking. Genesis, no, I don't know how this ended up after Exodus, is actually one of the more forgiving rolling block stages I've played. Compared to brackets from Monkey 2 World 10, this really isn't so bad. Trick Room is perhaps the single most impressive and fully faceted maze stage ever, filled with one-way walls that keep you on your toes the entire time. It's great.
One of my favorite playtesting experiences to share was Trick Room. So the concept of the stage is a bunch of one-way walls, so it's like you can't backtrack past certain points. And the idea was, all right, whenever you go through an invisible wall, or a one-way wall at low speed, which you can't see when you're approaching it, so it's basically an invisible wall, you get popped forward a little. So the idea is he wants to make all the transitions so that you will never get screwed over by that pop. So to go, he gave me a top-down map of everything, and I was just like, okay, test the transitions. Tell me what about what. And I returned to him with a map with like all these different color-coded like things with different, just showing, okay, well, these are the bad transitions, these are the okay transitions, these are the perfectly fine ones, these are things I'd change, you know, like add banana bunches here, have other notes as well, like for the really crazy stages, sometimes you had to do stuff like that.
When I was super young, my favorite toy was this thing called Perplexus. It looked like this clear ball that had all these things inside of it, and you had to roll like a little marble through it.
Ouroboros is mostly known for its absolutely bonkers star switch, a feature exclusive to it as far as I'm aware. It behaves like a fast forward, but on Ouroboros it is an exceptional boost in difficulty due to the constant rotation of the stage. It is fascinating how you can change your routing though. Red Sea, much like Upstream for World 7, looks amazing here and plays even better. The constant flow of the stage is very impressive considering its length, with that corner cross being one of the most nerve-wracking in the game. Shadow Tag is a stage that I absolutely adore in concept. It reminds me of the Metal Sonic race at the end of Certa Speedway, but man, the way the Shadow actually has collision is really frustrating on occasion. Had this behaved more like a developer time trial ghost, I think this would have worked much better. And last but certainly not least, is Curtain Call. A supremely difficult gauntlet and highlight reel of every past world, plus an amazing ending that I feel I absolutely cannot spoil here. My only issue is the focus breaker wire just being a little too thin, but that's far from being the end of the world. Well, actually, it is pretty close to the end of the world, but you know what I mean. As I was about to cross the last gold tape though, something dawned on me when it came to these massive levels that Gaiden is known for. Something crucial. These stages aren't mere exams. They're not even boss fights. They're challenge modes. By looking back on what I've commented on up to this point, it's pretty clear that my preference for Monkey Ball's progression is challenge mode. The linearity, the intuitability, the inherent challenge of especially expert mode is something I've come to appreciate quite a lot more recently. That's not to say I can't enjoy a good learner stage, but there's something intrinsically lost with story mode. What I think makes challenge mode so much more impactful to me than story mode is how the former forces you to get better in a way that the latter doesn't. The intensive gauntlet that expert has you go through, forcing you to learn and eventually master each and every bit of it if you want to earn a chance to face the master level, is in effect with no parallel in story. The only reason one would put the same effort into story is an external one. It comes purely from an individual desire to better understand the game, with no greater reward for doing so. That's great for people who have that drive inherently, but there's nothing in the game to enforce that approach to story mode. Gaiden found a solution to that in a way that I never thought would have worked as well as it does here. A carefully designed microcosm of challenge mode level design compacted into massive gauntlet stages. To be clear, this isn't a one-to-one comparison. Even in Monkey Ball 1, practice mode was always available if you wanted to try any individual pieces of the puzzle. And while that aspect was sorely missed by me a couple of times during some of Gaiden's particularly brutal ending challenges, there's something fascinating to be had with the lack of that option. A virtuosity in being able to complete the run in that strict hierarchy. In the end, the accomplishment of completing the marathon can be all the sweeter when dealing with the limitations Gaiden presents you with. Perhaps that's why Gaiden is so fascinating to so many. It manages to bridge the gap of appeal between story and challenge mode in a way no other pack has, not even my other favorites. There really is something incredible in that.
I like the infinite lives. It allows people to really get into like this zen state of trying over and over, even if something seems really hard. But losing that resource lives, it means that I can't get as bonkers with level design. I would never put something like apparatus or even stuff like light speed in challenge because it's just sort of hard to get the idea of the stage on the first go. Actually, light speed's not really that, but it's hard to understand certain times on like your first go. But having that infinite lives is a big factor. I think the reason why I end up with a lot of marathon levels with a lot of like different bits but an underlying mechanic to them all is because I think this level I want to be a marathon level where you go down, or like this one I want the whole thing to be about unlocking bits to a final mechanism that shoots you through the air. I feel like I've really helped contribute to a lot of the levels that have multiple ways to beat them, and just a lot of larger scale levels in general.
And nowhere in the game is that feeling felt more than in Gaiden's true finale. After all the cool tricks and exceeding of expectations up to this point, it should be no surprise that Gaiden has one more up its sleeve, even after the game was ostensibly over. In this case, one of the coolest unlockable setups I've ever seen in a platformer. I won't spoil it for those hunting for each piece on their own, but I don't feel too bad for spoiling what lies beyond the gate. Just note that the QR code is the single most important hint in the stage for completing it, just in case you missed it on your first go-around like I did. Now then, what exactly was behind that gate? Oh, nothing much. Just literal Monkey Ball hell. No, not figuratively, literally. This 10-ring journey through hell doubles as both the hardest world in Gaiden, as well as the only linear world constructed within SMB2's engine to date. Even in the game it's actually denoted as World EX. Nice touch. And man does World EX live up to its position as the successor to Runic Realm. Master of All acts as the final tie to the main game via continuation of Master of None from World 3. Although this time with a happy helping of extra thin wires and quite the time crunch. Maelstrom is the closest to a freebie you're getting in World EX, as unlike every other EX stage, it isn't a multifaceted obstacle course that can be completed accordingly quickly once you know what you're doing. Don't worry though, You have Tartarus waiting for you once you're done. This literally titanic jailbreak is where you get the feel for the rest of World EX on the whole, which is that every stage is so massive that it transcends being experienced like a normal level and becomes like a challenge mode all on its own. And expect that to take quite a few lives once you really start taking it on. Also no, there is no continue or life functionality for those wondering. Gaiden opted for recontextualizing the old life counter into a death counter to great effect. This is a super nice change from normal story mode actually, and also helps make up for the lack of a retry button on the many ultra tall levels like Tartarus. Still doesn't stop me from occasionally pressing pause as I fall out of instinct though. Sisyphus is infamous among speedrunners for button RNG, but when it comes to playing the stage normally, such RNG doesn't really affect the game. As for the rest of the stage, it makes use of some particularly tricky backtracking. Acheron is probably my least favorite of the 10. Don't get me wrong, I love me a good flaming pentagram, and that mini-golf axe mechanic is pretty neat, if a little odd to put together at first. The issues I have with Acheron is mostly in its opening section, mostly due to that really tricky bonk off of this ramp. It's very hard to land due to all the stuff in the way of the minimap. The coil and vanilla guillotine on the ramp system is actually my favorite part, so much so that I wish they'd made it into story levels too. Fortunately, Acheron and its minor shortcomings is followed up by the best stage in the game, Styx. No really, hidden at World EX6 lies one of the most brilliant lighting in a bottle stage executions ever. It's genuinely up there with 8 Bracelets from Monkey Ball 2 as an all-time favorite for me. The stage involves you crossing the river Styx in a controllable raft. Once it starts, there's no stopping it, so it becomes this hectic and brilliant challenge of shifting the raft to the necessary positions in order to unlock the gates required to progress. I wouldn't change a single thing about it. Maybe this ramp. While Styx is adored by many, I'm of the belief that Pride is actually an underrated stage. That might be because I like wires more than most, but Pride makes some really fun challenges with them. I think my only issue is the sweet spot texture on the portal section. The texture extends past the thinner wire in such a way that you could definitely get false positives. The ending choice is great though. I feel similarly about Babel, although bear in mind that the time crunch is a little deceptive on here. The non-linearity is really welcome with obstacles like these, and this is one of the only times Gaiden offers you such freedom. Gauntlet is more of a warm-up for the ending, and as such is mostly notable for another example of non-linearity, albeit slightly less obviously. Also, that ending vault is very satisfying. But at last, the only stage left is none other than the grand finale. Just like Curtain Call is the ending to the main game, the grand finale acts as a brilliant gambit of all of Gaiden's trickiest obstacles, combined into one 5-minute long tour de force of Monkey Ball level design. And it is amazing. Brutal? Absolutely. Frustrating? No doubt about it, especially that 0.2 wire that has certainly earned its place in hell. But there's no doubt in my mind that Gaiden shouldn't have, nor could it have, ended any other way. To my surprise, Gaiden lived up to every expectation that had been set for it before I played it. And I came in with a fair few pretty big ones. Again, it's the go-to favorite for both speedrunners and creative peers alike. Its influence on making creators think bigger, both literally and figuratively, in terms of level design, is still being felt 2 years after it was released, and doesn't look to be leaving anytime soon. By achieving such an intricate balance of polish, inventiveness, and an unparalleled sense of progression, Gaiden has managed to do what Monkey Ball did 2 years prior, and not simply raise the bar, but shoot it into the stratosphere. The effect of that is being felt now more than ever as an entire new generation of Romhacks awaits us within the next couple of years. Though the drought is tough for the moment, the amount of incredible work being done now on Launch, Monkey 2DE, the EX Revival, Stardust, Rush Battle, all of which have taken inspiration from Gaiden in one way or another, is inspiring. I gotta say, Generation 4 of Monkey Ball Romhacking is shaping up to be the best one yet. So if we have Gaiden at least partially to thank for that, then I think that's pretty special. So in case you've made it this far, and somehow haven't experienced Gaiden yet, go play the best Monkey Ball game since the classics. And for that matter, if you've made it this far without trying any of these, rest assured that getting a hold of them has never been easier. The Romhack spreadsheet I've compiled has links to everything, including the Desert Heatwave fix for packs that need it, as well as the GCT file for using debug mode on the original hardware, for packs with extra content affiliated with it. So, go play some custom Monkey Ball. I promise you won't regret it. So, that's it, right? That's every Monkey Ball Romhack from within the time frame I set. All covered. And while it's true that we've covered all of them, there's actually one more. Not to review though. Check the description of this video or the card on your screen. See you at the end.